Hey everybody, Patrick Hunter here, and welcome to the Knuckles and Gloves podcast. Boxing this weekend. Little guys, little fighters, super flyweights, junior bantamweights. That's not us. But that's what's happening this weekend. Be here with my boy Aris Pina, Compubox operator, and of course, fellow history fanatic guy, dude, my friend. What's up? How you doing, Aris?
Everything's going really good, my man. Today's better than it was yesterday in terms of the heat, so that makes it a better day.
Man, we got some hot action this weekend, I think, though. I mean,
We absolutely do.
I can't
I mean,
imagine it would go any other way between Bam Rodriguez and Juan Francisco Estrada, dude.
it's an exciting fight, man. I mean, it's definitely the fight, in my opinion, it's the fight of the night. Like you also have was it Teofimo defending his belt on ESPN, but clearly the most competitive fight, the big fight, the one that everybody's really savoring about is Bam Rodriguez against Juan Francisco Estrada for the super flyweight championship. And I mean, this is a big ass fight. Like in terms of little guys, it's one of those that like you get in the absolute best of the best. Rodriguez has been gone on a run of an incredible run since he came on the scene. And who was it that he beat? Was it Quadras at first?
oh, like his kind of
Or
like his breakout performance.
yeah,
Yeah.
his breakout
Yeah.
fight. Yeah, one of them. I mean, like he was already a star, and then he jumped up a couple of divisions, and that's when everyone's just kind of like, holy shit. And Estrada, his resume speaks for himself. All of his losses, he's avenged as a pro, even though, you can question his fights with Chocolatito going which way, whatever. But like the guy has an incredible resume, future Hall of Famer himself, and the fact that both of them are getting a chance to fight each other now and it's happening this weekend. Yeah, bro, I'm hyped.
We are fortunate to live in an era. I mean, there are a lot of things that we could say about boxing that are disappointing, bad. We're cynical about a lot of stuff, admittedly, but when it comes to the lower weight divisions, we definitely live in an era right now that we're fortunate to see a lot more than we have in other eras or would have in the past. And granted, this 115-pound division, whatever you want to call it, super flyweight, junior bantamweight, however you want to call it, hasn't really been around that long compared to other divisions. And we'll get a little bit into the history of it, but yeah, we're fortunate right now that there seems to be a much greater appreciation for the lower weight fighters than there historically have been, which we've talked about numerous times on the show. So I'm happy that there's a lot more focus on stuff like this, and that this is something where on top of that, two fighters who are directly catering to the Mexican fan base are nonetheless still seen as fighters that are putting together a kind of like lower weight super fight that a lot of fans are looking forward to. So it's cool stuff.
Yeah, it's really cool stuff. And it took a long time to get to that point. Notoriously, the networks never really featured the lower weight fighters. It really took up until, if you really think about it, like there wasn't, because the thing is, when it comes to television, everything's always been catered toward like the big stars and like, American fighters and stuff like that, especially back in the 80s and such. But like they would feature, other people from other countries, but never usually from like the really lower weight divisions. Like the lowest they would ever get was usually like Wilfredo Gomez at, 122. Or sometimes the bantamweight division where Carlos Zarate at his peak, for instance. But other than that, it took until when HBO and Showtime became like the mega networks in terms of showing fights and stuff like that. Um, it really took until Michael Carbajal after he won the 88 Olympics after the 88 Olympics, and then when he turned pro and had that incredible war with Chiquita Gonzalez and also being promoted by Bob Arum, that people started taking notice to the little guys. Also add in the fact with like Ricardo Lopez came on the scene, and when he was featured with Don King, even though he was always buried on their undercard, he was still being seen. So you add in that, and then guys that we'll talk about in a little bit, guys like Mark Johnson and Johnny Tapia, Danny Romero, and slowly but surely, the little guys started being featured more and more. I mean, like, the 122 division obviously came quicker with the emergence of like Barrera, Morales, McKinney, Junior Jones, and so on and so forth like that. But, before you knew it, the bantamweights, junior bantamweights, flyweights even started getting their day in the sun.
Yeah, it has taken a long time. And there's no question that there is a number of kind of journalists and stuff like that who carried the torch. We've mentioned Joe Koizumi a number of different times, and he's somebody who falls into that category here without question. The fighters that you were talking about, the Mark Johnsons, the Carbajal, a lot of those guys, those are fighters who really helped spark interest in the U.S. But of course, we're going to try to do our best to mention as many also non-American fighters as we can,
Exactly.
because those are ultimately who carry the vast majority of these lower weight divisions, throughout the years.
Quick question. I was like reading some like old ringside reports in the magazine today. Do you think Joe Koizumi was traveling everywhere to like provide those, or was he just getting tapes? Because like one week he'd be in Tokyo, the next he'd be somewhere in Korea, the next he'd be somewhere else, and then he'd be back in Tokyo 2 weeks later. I mean, was he on site for all those back then, or do you think that like he was just getting report? I have no idea. I was just curious about that because if so, that's a fucking hell of a career. I would love
I,
to just travel every other week to like different countries out somewhere, on location like that. I mean, people do it now in the US, but just thinking about it, I don't know.
I hope that at some point somebody has the foresight to interview that guy and do a literal like tell us about all the shit that you've done in boxing since like the 1960s, or
He's
maybe
been
even
around
the
forever. I
yeah,
mean, he's
maybe the
been around.
50s, but I know for
I
sure. I
mean, I
think
don't know how far back his career goes, but like we've talked about it before that we were kids when we started reading his ringside reports and others like Lee Groves and stuff talked about how they came up reading his ringside reports. So I mean, the man's been around forever. So
yeah, I'm almost starting to think maybe it's like the Princess Bride, where there's like the Dread Pirate Roberts. There's like many Joe Koizumis. There's like various versions because he just can't. I mean, it's crazy. It is. I mean, I don't know if he was actually there for all of those. I honestly have no idea. I've noticed that too, and I have thought that where I'm like, damn, dude, this fool's in like Bangkok, Tokyo. He's
yeah,
going to, Seoul. He's going over here. It's crazy. Is it possible? Yeah. I mean, it's possible. Is it likely? I don't know. I'm not going to question him.
I was just curious, like, was that on his dime? Was Ring Magazine like, putting the bill for those? I just want to know.
No idea.
Promoters
But
doing it, people on their own because he was such a respectable name. Who knows?
all I know is that he kept us up on a lot of that shit before we can get tapes. That's for sure.
1000%. Everybody that I knew about as a kid reading, I just read about it through his ringside reports, whether it was Ring or KO or what are those other ones. That's how you kept up with those guys, and the occasional photo of them too.
Crazy. Yeah. And, a lot of, there have been in recent years, there's been more dedication, like I said, more writers and reporters and stuff like that willing to spend their time covering these fighters of lower weights. But talking about this weekend, we don't have to go down the careers and the ledgers of both of these fighters. But I mean, I do think that it is pretty amazing, like I said, that there's enough attention focused on this fight this weekend that it's kind of like a fan favorite fight or whatever. And I mean, it's also amazing to me that Estrada in particular, I mean, it's kind of unfortunate actually because he's been a little bit inactive in the last handful of years in particular. Not that I blame him because it's like every single fight seems to be like a fucking war. So I mean, I don't want him going through a war every 3 months or something like that. But that being said, it almost feels like, we haven't seen nearly as much of him as we should have in his prime, which might be behind him given his size. He's like 33 or 34. And
Yeah.
generally, fighters who are at that size, they tend to burn out a lot quicker. But even so, just a handful of years ago, a lot of people don't realize exactly how popular he is in Mexico. And again, like you wouldn't know because you're not there, but the dude draws like insane TV numbers in Mexico when he fights, like in the tens of millions and shit. It's crazy.
I mean, he's a massive star, and he has the style that brings it. And he's not a braggadocious dude for the most part, right?
Not really, no. I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah. I mean, for just kind of keeps to himself and all that. Plus, I know he had a rough background too, like a really like a tough background with his family and stuff. I know losing family members and everything. So like, he's just one of those type of dudes, bro. Like he's put it all in there. I mean, when he first came on the scene, uh, what year was it that he when he fought Chocolatito the first time?
I think I want to say either 2013 or 2014,
2012. Okay, around then, right?
but let me double check because now I
I
want to make
was
sure. Oh
thinking
gosh,
2012.
2012. Yeah,
That's what I thought. 2012.
because remember that shit wasn't on like it was on like Wealth TV, I think.
Larry Holmes was on commentary and clearly had no idea who either one of those guys were.
I want to say it was on Wealth TV, but it was on some weird channel that the member they had like brought and then because I remember watching that and it was like a really good card overall. Then the fight itself was great. Yeah.
But
Wow,
yeah, that was
2012. Holy shit.
and it was
Fuck.
one of those fights that like I think Larry Holmes was on commentary. He had no idea what was, who either one of the guys were. But he went along with it and enjoyed it. Kind of reminds you of how like Don King would randomly insert him um on various DKP shows way back in like the late 70s and early 80s strictly because he was heavyweight champion and he was like forced to commentate on fights he probably didn't know much about nor did he really give a shit about. Same thing there, but like he got into it and it was a great fight. Getting back to the thing, it was a great fight. And Estrada, who was more relatively unknown at that point, gave a prime Chocolatito, a dude who was rampaging everybody, a hell of a fight. Like he ran him to the limit. You know what I mean? Like it was a loss that like it was a competitive loss where like I haven't watched it in years, but from what I remembered of it, Chocolatito won, pretty convincingly, but no one had pushed him like that at that point. You know what I mean? And for a guy who was kind of unknown, that put him on the radar with everybody, that you just kind of like, holy shit, who is this dude? And not only that, he's probably gonna be a future world champion because he would have
Yeah.
beaten anyone that night that wasn't Chocolatito.
Exactly. That was, I think that was kind of what a lot of people, myself included, came away thinking after watching the fight was that, basically Chocolatito landed the cleaner punches, the harder punches. His combinations were just crisp as fuck, and he knew what was going on in there, but he was pushed. And if this kid that he was fighting had a couple more years experience, he might have been in trouble in there. It might have been a very nip and tuck fight. And of course, a handful of years later, that's exactly what we saw. And also with a little bit of slippage from Chocolatito too, but it, in a higher weight, et cetera, et cetera. But that being said, yeah, it was a fantastic fight. And it definitely showcased the greatness of, gosh, 108 pounds. They fought at 108 pounds, but they've both come up a few different divisions and have, shown that they're neck and neck basically as far as Chocolatito obviously a little bit farther ahead, but basically neck and neck.
Yeah, I mean it's been a and not only that, those were the guys that started putting the little guys on the map again too, where maybe that resurgence where not only were you recognize these were the best fighters on the planet, but they were finally getting the recognition of it too, where the television networks, it wasn't just, I mean, especially HBO. Got to give Tom Loeffler credit on this one when he started doing that Superfly series. He was first that because like Chocolatito was one of those guys. He was because this was still like the early days of like the early when he became champion, it was YouTube was still in its infancy more or less, right? He became champ around 2007 or some shit. And so as he was coming
And
along,
a
he was still
minimum weight too. And so
yeah,
people,
at
people just
105.
didn't even give a fuck. They were just like minimum weight. I mean,
I mean,
I'm just saying, like, not
you're
me.
totally correct. You're absolutely correct. And it was one of those things where like he just everybody if you knew back then, all right? Like, people in the new like I knew about him, you knew about him. If you were reading and following along stuff like that, you knew that Arguello had this prodigy that he was just bringing along that
He
was an
was on some
absolute
undercards, but buried pretty deep.
very. But there was like clips going around and you saw various things going out there that you just heard about him and you're just like, okay, like, he's someone to watch. So when he finally got his first title shot against a respectable title holder and Yukata, what was it, how do you pronounce his last name? Nita? Um when he fought
Yeah,
Nita,
yeah.
he beat the holy hell out of him. It was only 4 rounds, but like 4 rounds of carnage. So, anyways, as he goes around, dominates the strawweight division, starts moving up and stuff like that, Loeffler takes hold of his career and, brilliantly starts putting on the undercards of Triple G. And at this point, Chocolatito already had a deeper resume than Triple G could have even dreamed of. You know what I mean? Like that guy was one of the most best champions on the planet, but no one had really seen him. And so when he makes his first chance, no, his first chance, his debut on HBO against what was it, Edgar Sosa? who was a respectable guy, but probably a little bit on the back end, blast him in 2 rounds, and right away, everyone starts going along with it. So like once he puts on that first card too, with like Chocolatito, Quadras, um, who else was on that card?
Oh, well, I know that he had paired Chocolatito with Golovkin a couple times,
Sure,
and
yeah,
and that was really what had
more
kind
than
of,
everything.
yeah, pushed. Yeah, it was Golovkin and Monroe, and Gonzalez versus Sosa was the first
That was an
one,
early night for me.
and then Golovkin Lemieux,
Yeah,
Gonzalez Valoria.
okay. And after that, when he did like the Quadras show and such, like that's when things really started,
Yeah.
going the way they did. And it's like from even there, Estrada eventually got into the mix. Estrada gets matched with Quadras. Chocolatito gets knocked out, shockingly, by Sor Rungvisai. Now Sor Rungvisai is in the mix too. Like all these dudes are getting intertwined, kind of like the Four Kings, but this is at 115. And I'd rather call these guys the Little Kings as opposed to calling, Ryan Garcia and Tank and Haney and them the new ones, right?
Yeah,
So
people are getting a little ahead of themselves with this.
just a little bit. So we it was making for incredible fights too. You know what I mean? Like these were the type of fights that harken back to the early days of HBO boxing after dark. No showcases, all 50-50 for the most part, with the exception I think of like Inoue coming in for a showcase fight. But like these were just fascinating ones. And Estrada pulled out from the bunch. He lost his first fight with Saurung Vasai, came back and scraped along and beat him in a rematch. And then you had the rematches with Chocolatito. And whether you think he won or lost some of those fights, that's entirely on you, especially the Chocolatito fights, because those were nip and tuck. And Chocolatito, I think, especially in the third fight, a lot of people felt that he won that one. But regardless, Estrada has showed himself to be the king of this division right now. And the fact that Bam is coming up here and the resume that he's been able to build just so quickly. And I mean, the brilliance that he's shown with it, man. This dude is doing moves that people haven't been, seen since the days of like Orlando Canizales with the footwork and shit. Like, this is just a can't miss fight. And you gotta wonder too, has like the wars caught up with Estrada, and is this gonna be Bam's coming out party, or is Estrada still, even though he's been off a little bit and stuff like that, and he might, and we don't know where he's gonna be at. Like, does he still have enough in him to ward off this, young lion? It's the variables are there, so
It's definitely set up the narrative or whatever is kind of set up for the proverbial, passing of the torch. Basically, you have the guy who's 34. While that is young, he's had a number of different wars and a number of different really close, tough fights against really tough, you know, fighters that are just hard fucking guys.
the hard
And,
34, I would say.
three fucking fights with Roman Gonzalez.
Mhm.
Uh, you know, uh, gosh, dude, I mean, there's been, I'm not getting on his ass for being inactive. I don't blame him because he probably needs a long time off after the run that he has been on. But that being said, we don't really know what he's going to look like when he gets back in there. Whereas this is kind of like a totally different world now, dude. And part of that is Rodriguez. He sort of rose to fame fighting in the bubble. A lot of people forget the fucking bubble, bro. Remember, the pandemic's still going. There's some motherfucking COVID raging around right now this summer. But when shit was really shut down and boxing was pretty barren for a few months, Top Rank had figured their way to make some boxing still happen and basically quarantined fighters within this quote unquote bubble in Las Vegas or whatever so that people could still fight. And I mean, yeah, it sounds kind of ridiculous or whatever, but it shit made some shit happen. And Bam Rodriguez had kind of rose to fame partially fighting, I think, two or three times in Top Rank's bubble, and then from there really shot to fame with a few of his wins. So I mean, a lot of it's a really condensed version, but a lot of what has happened in Bam Rodriguez's career has happened in the last few years. And so it's really tough to say where Estrada is going to be when he gets back in there. And it's also worth noting that a lot of people were picking Sonny Edwards to beat Rodriguez. That was a pretty close to 50-50 kind of fight going into it for a lot of people. And I mean, Rodriguez just beat the shit out of him, man.
He absolutely did. And someone made a good point. It's like, because Bam is the complete fighter. If he had three times the power, as opposed to like the footwork and everything else he did, Sonny Edwards probably just would have outboxed him and, cruised to an easy decision. But instead, if you just watch the way he did, like Edwards is so awkward and he's slippery and he's this and that. And it's the guy that's horrible to fight. And and a guy to easily lose to too. But you can't win. It's really tough to win a decision over a guy like that just because of his awkwardness. But Bam just broke him down systematically. It was one of those performances of one of those guys that's like a pound for pound entrant. Kind of reminiscent
I
of
expected more from Sonny Edwards, and I'm not like a fan at
sure.
all, but I
Me
was
and
like,
I totally get you, but like when you get shut down like that by a guy, it's like sometimes they just know how to systematically break you down. Kind of reminiscent of like a Mike McCallum, for instance, where they're not going out there and trying to one punch knock you out the whole time, but each round they're
yeah,
just breaking you
there's not a
down
lot
more and
flashy
more.
or
There's
whatever.
nothing
It's
flashy about it. It's just a straight up beat down from an absolute technician who's just in there doing their job and just knows how to counteract anything you're trying to do. They just have an answer for it. And when you're checkmated, basically in every type of thing you do, there's nothing you can do. And that's the type of thing that Bam Rodriguez does with these guys now. The way he moves, the way he counteracts and stuff like that. He's shown that he can take a punch because didn't he suffer a broken jaw?
yeah,
Um,
yeah,
um,
and he's it's not like he hasn't been hit, you know what I mean? Like, but
and
the
he's a
pro
smaller guy compared to these guys, and he's showing himself that he can take it through. So Rungvisai is one of the thickest and biggest and just brute strength, strongest guys out there at 115. And not only Rodriguez, who was moving up to take him on, and much smaller than that, weathered his storm. And yeah, so Rungvisai was probably a little past it, but it doesn't really matter. The guy was still winging him and gave a hell of an effort. And Rodriguez just again systematically each round broke him down, broke him down, broke him down. By the time the fight was finally ended, so Rungvisai was completely spent, and this is what he does to guys. You know what I mean? He doesn't have one punch knockout power. He's not going to flatten you like Tommy Hearns or anything like that, but he doesn't need to. He has the whole everything else around there just stymies you.
Yeah, he seems like he would be just a nightmare to fight.
Sure.
A guy who doesn't really stop, doesn't really give you a whole lot of room, and knows what to do.
Mm-hmm.
And like you said, on top of that, he's already proven that he's already taken on a handful of punchers and a handful of fighters that are like physically strong fighters. Carlos Cuadras is a physically strong fighter. Sarung Vasai, physically strong. Sonny Edwards looked strong in his fights coming into that fight. I mean, so and he is basically it's not that none of these fighters have had their moments, especially Cuadras. He made it kind of close in a few of those rounds, but that being said, he has for the most part just beaten almost all these guys down. So I don't know how you stop that momentum if you're Estrada. I mean, you got to stop it pretty early. That's for sure. I can't imagine he's going to want this young guy to get too much momentum on him, because then it's kind of like once you get that ball rolling, dude, it's really tough to stop. But what do you think is going to happen this weekend?
I honestly think it's gonna be it's not his coming out party because I already came out before, but like I think that Rodriguez is gonna beat him. Yeah, I don't know if he's gonna stop him or not, but I have a feeling he's gonna comprehensively defeat him. And Estrada is a great fighter. That's not a knock on him. And if he gets put on the ballot for the Hall of Fame, I'm probably gonna be inclined to vote for him. Okay. But I just think that it's, the way things are going right now in their careers and take into account everything that Estrada has been through in his career, this is Rodriguez's time. And if he's going to do it, and he knows too that this is like the biggest fight of his career, even though he's accomplished a ton so far. I'm talking about Bam, that is. And he knows if he wins this one, this is going to solidify himself near the top of the pound for pound, at least within like the number five, number six range, I would think. And I mean, everyone debates that dumb shit. Who knows? But I'm just saying off the top of my
Yeah,
head.
name whatever number you want, but he's definitely among the top fighters of the
He's
world.
going to be one of the top fighters in the world. And he's already said too that he eventually wants to fight Inoue, and he thinks that's going to be one of the biggest fights in boxing. And what better way than to like, solidify yourself as the man at 115 in old Inoue division by just absolutely decimating their top champion in Estrada before you go over and eventually get a fight with him. I mean, like Rodriguez is a small guy too. I mean, he's smaller than anyway, and like I don't know what his like absolute ceiling is gonna be, but he's still a young guy too. He's still very young, so I mean, he can only grow from here.
Yeah, this is going to be his 20th fight, his 20th pro fight.
Yeah. I'm gonna
That's
say Estrada. I'm gonna say Estrada in 10. Not Estrada, excuse me. Bam in 10.
This is only his 20th pro fight. That's it's I guess that's another kind of hallmark
Yeah.
of a lot of these lower weight fighters is they tend to kind of just get to the shit a lot quicker. You don't see a whole lot of fucking, 60 and 0, 61 and 2 type of, from champions and shit like that. It's more like, 8 and 1, then they get the fucking title shot. It's crazy. But yeah, this is only his 20th pro fight. And so, I mean, just looking real quick, yeah, 20th, and then Juan Francisco Estrada. Fuck yeah, this will be his 49th. Yeah, that's pretty crazy. So I think that probably I'm gonna also go with Bam. Um, damn, I'm gonna guess by decision.
You're going by
Uh,
decision.
yeah, I think he's gonna take a decision, but like a clear decision.
Yeah.
I think Estrada's had maybe a couple too many wars. He's had some time off. There's always the argument that taking time off, fighters come back refreshed, or you know what I mean. That's the possibility. It's not out of the realm of possibility, but I think that it's also that's kind of like the belief in like a vacuum though. Time marches on, bro. A fighter comes back 2 years later, they're 2 years older. Their
That was,
their reflexes are 2 years older. Like
mhm.
everything's fucking 2 years older. And so unless you're still in your physical prime, and I would imagine Estrada's probably not. Um, yeah, dude, time marches on, and I think that that's probably fucking what we're looking at is like I said earlier, the handing of the baton.
I totally agree with that. I think Bam could stop him in 10. I could see a decision too, but I have a feeling he might stop him late.
Yeah, and I think that that would be like you said, a really convincing. If he can stop Estrada, that's number one, kind of establishing himself as like the new, like, all right, there's a new sheriff in town, and like that's old news type of guy. And number two, like you said, it's the people laughing now about like, oh, a new way. No, come on, that's a bad idea. Well, that kind of raises it to like, well, maybe, like, okay.
Totally.
If you're going into this fight and struggling or something like that, and then I think the talk of like a new way showdown or something like that's probably off the table for now.
But if he dominates, then I think that's a better discussion than him and the ongoing one about him and Tank Davis. Talk about in a way that is.
What do you want from a new? What do you want? Get the fucking
I
come on.
mean, I'm not
There's
even gonna.
lightweights for that guy to fight. Fuck
They
off.
just want him to be another Pacquiao. I don't know for whatever reason why, but they just assume, oh well, if you could beat him, why don't you just fight Tank? Why?
Why doesn't Tank just fight the lightweights that are there?
I mean, Tank already said he's a fan of him. Inoue said he's a fan of him. They're not like eyeing each other for
Yeah,
a
who
potential
cares?
fight. Like,
What?
stop.
It's so weird to like pit them against. That doesn't even make sense.
That's just boxing fans are stupid in
Fight
general.
lightweights, Tank.
Yeah, you know what I mean? Which he is. He just fought a lightweight, and Inoue's gonna fight, is staying in his division too, and he has no inclination talking about going to 135.
Hey, my only complaint is I just want to see Tank fight more. Like it's not even.
Same. They're my two favorite fighters to watch currently right now, and I'm assuming that'll go for most people talking boxing too. You know what I mean? Like I love watching Inoue fight and Tank watching. I mean, sometimes it's a little bit of a labor because he has to get going after a while, but something spectacular is going to happen sooner or later, and it's fascinating to watch him break a guy down. But I don't need to hear them talk about fighting each other when it's never going to happen. Like, stop. Anyways, I mean, yeah, if Rodriguez looks really, really impressive in this fight, I mean, I don't think the Inoue fight would be there immediately afterwards, nor would it should be, but like that's something to definitely build to in the next year or so.
Yeah, and I think that also we've seen that at least I would imagine that Naoya Inoue has probably figured that in his last few fights, at least it seems to me that he's figured like, okay, I'm not going a whole lot higher than this. Like this is, I'm not. it's taken me a little bit longer to break some of these guys down, and they're not reacting quite as much to my punches right away. I mean, don't get me wrong, he's still blasting motherfuckers, but it's you can it seems like he knows that there's a difference and that he's not speaking very quickly about moving up and up and up again. So I would imagine that that could be on the table.
1,000%. And I'd look forward to it. You know what I mean? But at first things first, I'm looking forward to this weekend.
Yeah, it should be
I'm
a
working it too. I think I'm probably I'm probably counting Bam for that matter, if he's the challenger. So
good luck, dude, because there should be some punches thrown.
absolutely. I mean, at least it won't be boring.
Yeah, for
That's
sure.
the
It
championship, right?
shouldn't be too tedious. Yeah, and you know what, dude? That's actually the name of a lot of these lower weight divisions, and in particular, 115 pounds, dude. Um, there've been a lot of notable and really exciting fights at 115 pounds. Like I said earlier, the only kind of lamentable thing is that a lot of them have happened off of US television, and many of them we've had to find out about or go back and watch like decades later.
Sure.
And you do kind of have to go out of your way. And I liken it almost to kind of like watching movies, like foreign movies or something like that. You know what I'm saying? Like I don't speak a lot of these other languages. And so if I'm going to watch a foreign movie, yeah, I got to watch some subtitles or whatever, but so fucking what? I'm not going to cry about it. And similarly, if I'm going to watch fights from sometimes 3, 4 decades ago from Korea or wherever, no, obviously I don't understand what the fuck they're talking about with the commentating, but that's not necessarily what I'm watching for, and I can also figure out what's going on without understanding the commentating. So, like I said, it is a little bit of a labor sometimes, and I do get when people say that, but I just don't personally care because a lot of the time the entertainment value is still totally there.
1,000%, even more so. And the fact is, we're in this era too. We've talked about this where this is all at your fingertips. It's not to the point where like, well, I can't watch these guys. They're not featured on TV. We don't have tape of them. Blah 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 blah. All you gotta do is go on YouTube. All you have to do is type in Khaosai Galaxy. A bunch of his fights are gonna come up. You can type in any of those guys, even the very first champions from this division, a fight of theirs will come up. There is a lot of people that will upload these things. You can give a shout out to like Combat Chronicles, our buddy Kyle from Twitter, who's a major fan of the lower weight divisions and has posted a bunch of those fights from the past. Lee Groves, who he doesn't have a YouTube page, but I mean he's shed a lot of light on these guys. Our buddy there from Boxing Journals, Taj, like people like that. They're they were always keeping those in the limelight. There's no excuse now to be like, oh, these guys are both, whatever. Like the division again too, it's not that old of a division. It kind of actually came out around the same time as the cruiserweights. And I can't even imagine being a boxing fan around 1980 and then these divisions starting to pop up and just thinking it's a conspiracy by the sanctioning bodies, which to a degree it probably was. But like, because when you really think about it, like it's not that much of a weight difference between 112. I mean, there was a big gap between 112 and 118, but like 115, people just, I'm sure back then were just like, well, what the fuck, man? All you gotta do is just eat a couple of pounds and you can do this. Like,
I
you're
mean,
not that big. And
I can't even tell you when the last time I weighed 118 pounds was, but just doing the basic math, 6 pounds of
that
118
is a wide
pounds
gap.
that's a significant amount, but that being said, according to the Wikipedia page, and emphasizing according to the Wikipedia page, and knowing that that is fucking Wikipedia. However, at this point, Wikipedia might just be, as long as there's a source named on there, might just be as reliable as nearly any other source at this point. But yeah, I mean, according to the Wikipedia page, the 115-pound division came about because the WBA and the WBC both petitioned to have a new division made because they said that basically the gap between 112 and 118 was too big. They felt that between flyweight and bantamweight was too much of a jump, which I don't know why they would specifically. I don't know. To me, it seems just as likely, like you said, that they were just trying to get a fucking, a couple more sanctioning fees or something like that. That makes as much sense to me as anything. But nonetheless, like you said, it happened in the early 1980s. right around the same time, the cruiserweight division, and similar to the cruiserweight division, like we did a cruiserweight history show and stuff like that. The cruiserweight division was actually something that got thought up like, 100 years before that and had been mentioned a long, long time before that, but just never really caught on and was thought of as kind of like a, bullshit division type of thing. Similarly, 115 pounds, or at least a division that was between flyweight and bantamweight, was thought up decades and decades earlier, but it just never really caught on. And as we've also talked about on other shows too, a lot of the other junior titles and stuff like that was like, almost referring to some of the fighters in like the 1930s or 1920s as multiple division champions is kind of shaky sometimes because they weren't really recognized as such at the time. Like even writers were just like, oh, this little bullshit title or this little,
Right.
puppy title or that type of weird type of shit they were always talking about. And similarly, anyway, 115 pounds or thereabouts mentioned, but it wasn't until the early 1980s that it really caught on. And similarly, also the IBF was coming about right around this time too, and the IBF's history was really helped to kind of get pushed forward by Larry Holmes and Larry Holmes' issues with the sanctioning bodies and dropping the heavyweight belts and then adopting the IBF belt. And that kind of helped the IBF get pushed to the forefront or more to the forefront or become a meaningful belt to a lot of people. That's why when we're talking about now and people say the four belt era, it's kind of like, it, it gets a little weird because we're just going to keep adding belts. We're going to have to research and keep hold of the fucking history of all this shit eventually. But anyway, that's really getting to the heart of the history of 115 pounds is starting in like the early 1980s, which was just early enough that nobody was really in the US watching any of this stuff happen, unfortunately, in real time.
Not only that, if you look back on the magazine ratings from like Ring Magazine and KO Magazine and stuff like that, and correct me if I'm wrong, they didn't even rate those guys in their own division back then. Like if they were champions, they might have got placed somewhere in the bantamweight rankings, but like nowhere near
Yes,
the
some
top.
didn't even have that
Yeah,
division at all. Yes,
yeah,
some
yeah,
some didn't even mention for a number of years the ring in particular just dropped the
right.
junior divisions at all. Like they refused to rank any junior divisions, period.
Yeah, so like you saw no ratings for strawweight, so you wouldn't even know who a strawweight champion was. Junior flyweight. Yeah, I think they kind of went back to like the original eight and stuff like that and just dropped the junior division for whatever reason. And you know, I'm not doing it. Ugh. So like
Like
it
ass
was
hipsters.
yeah, yeah, exactly. Um, but it took them for a long time to get that type of recognition too. But like you have to think about it. In the early days of that division, you had some legitimate great champions. You know what I mean? It just took like a little while to catch, because they weren't American. And so considering the division, like you said, it really came, I think, really to fruition around like 1980, 81. That's when they WBA and WBC, had their first champions. And from there, it took a minute because like again these guys weren't from America. Like the first champion that really made a mark, I would have to say would be Hiro Watanabe, right? Hiro Watanabe.
Yeah, Chiro, yeah.
Yeah, Jiro Watanabe. Bad motherfucker, guy, movie star looks and an incredible fighter, but a person that was on the Hall of Fame ballot for years, and I'm sure no one even gave two glances at because how many people really knew about him? He spent his career in Japan.
Unfortunately, that's been the case for a lot of these fighters. A lot of the fighters that fall into this division and a few others. But I mean, a number of these fighters don't get the recognition that they deserve on the Hall of Fame ballot, especially. And they've had to be, had to have the drum beaten for them over and over and over and over again to even get put on the ballot, period, because of the lack of understanding and the lack of, US eyes that have been laid on a lot of these fights and fighters, which is really unfortunate. But right around that time with Watanabe was when it really started kind of kicking forth, but also there were a number of Japanese fighters around that time too who were getting really popular, and he was among them.
Well, absolutely, man. His first title fight, he loses to a respectable champion that was from Korea, and soon after that, he became champ. But the thing that became interesting for him, that he became a little bit part of a footnote in history because he should have been a part of the first unification fight in that division when he fought the guy from Thailand. I read about this as a kid too because they talked about how they kind of fucked him over. He fought Pio Pun. I'll never be able to pronounce the name. Pio Puntarat. Puntarat.
Puntarat. Yeah, you got it.
Puntarat. Close enough, right? And Puntarar was WBC champion. Jiro was WBA champion. And they were supposed to, this shows you how long that Watanabe was champion, by the way, too, because he won the belt in 81. This is 84 now when he was going to unify. And when he fought Puntarat, this is a guy that he already beat, a really tough Thailand fighter, another guy that was a former kickboxer. And by the time he turned pro, he only needed limited pro fights before he became world champion. But, anyways, in their infinite wisdom, as they always did back then, whenever there was going to be a unification fight, either one of the sanctioning bodies would strip the other guy because they wanted nothing to do with their champion fighting someone else and having the chance of them losing to like a WBA champion or a WBA champion losing into a WBC champion because God forbid anything like that could happen. So these fights would happen, and then one guy would get stripped. In this case, it was Watanabe, and he beats Puntarat for the title and becomes WBC champion, starting his own reign over there. That's why boxing's such a stupid sport. But like,
These feuds have been going on longer than people realize, and that's what some of it's like old blood type of shit, and that's what's really dumb is that without going too off track, starting in the 1970s is when you mid 1970s is when you saw the sanctioning body split where the WBA basically and the WBC refused to cooperate with one another, refused to rank each other's champions, and we're basically just saying, oh, well, if we got to work with them, then fuck it, we'll strip the champion instead because we're not doing that shit. And that basically just became the MO. Like that just became whenever there was some shit that was going to happen or somebody's going to unify, unless that champion had the fucking pull to be like, back off. Like I'm the fucking champion. Unless the champion had the pull, like they were often trying to split that shit up. And with all due respect to Watanabe, you don't have the pull. He's not going to be able to demand shit. Nobody at 150 pounds or 115 pounds is going to be able to demand shit, and that's exactly what happened.
but it didn't matter, man. That dude built up a resume because if you look at his record right here, Gustavo Balas was 57-1. Shoji Aguma was a former world champion, a very respected world champion who went through the ringer with Miguel Canto and Batilio Gonzalez, and also scored that knockout over the guy that beat Canto, the guy from Korea there, um, Chang, something off the tip,
Chang Il
uh,
Sung
hmm?
or Chang Il Sung or
No, Chang, how something Chang. I can't pronounce off the top of my head. I can't remember, but it was the guy that beat he beat Kanto, and then he after he beat Kanto, he beat him in a rematch, and then or it was like a draw in a rematch. He also knocked out Gudi Espadas. I think like he was a really good champion, and when Oguma beat him by knockout, and he was a former champion himself. Like what was his name then? You
yeah,
got it?
Park Chan Hee, yeah.
Yeah. Park Chan-hee. There we go. So, anyways, Oguma was a respected former champion that came through a very tough round robin in the flyweight division. And so for the fact that when he moved up there and he got stopped by when he got stopped by Watanabe, again, that's a big win. And moving up through there throughout the years until he fought, that was supposed to be a unification, he was the first real champion of that division. Like I would call I wouldn't, I guess you would call him a star, right? At the star of the division. I mean, not worldwide all over the place because he primarily fought in Japan and everything like that. But I mean, in
Yeah.
terms of like first dominant champion of that division, you got to go with him.
I think he was on a couple shows during that time too. So he was definitely like a celebrity in Japan. Like its biggest
Yeah.
celebrity, nah, dude. Because like I said, there was actually a number of fighters right around that time in Japan that were kind of I think a couple came out of the same gym as well. But nonetheless, he was among them without question.
And I mean, like I said too, because he had movie star looks, man. He didn't look like like some kind of dude you would just see off the type of street. Like he had that type of, I don't know, he had this smooth mustache, the whole look. Like he had this type of like Bruce Lee look going on for him. Like a really just very distinct look, and the guy could just flat out fight. So I mean, yeah, definitely he would be popular out there.
Well, and it took the guy who's potentially the greatest fighter in the division, Gilberto Roman. I mean, if he's not the greatest fighter in the division, he's like top two or three, unquestionably. And it took him, perhaps the greatest fighter in the division, to defeat Watanabe and knock him off permanently.
And I mean, that's no easy feat to themselves. And like when you think about Gilberto Roman, that's another one too. Been largely forgotten over the years. And when a lot of people think about him or remember him, they know him. A lot of people kind of compare him to Salvador Sanchez, primarily because of their early deaths and the fact that they both were like boxers instead of sluggers when it came to like Mexican style or whatever, right? But like Gilberto Roman was an absolute genius in the ring, man. There was a guy that just like command of everything, And again, he wasn't a one punch knockout artist or anything like that. And he was a guy too that sometimes didn't come into the ring in the best of condition. He just kind of relied on his skills, which it was easy for him to do because he was just brilliant, an absolute brilliant fighter. And by the time Watanabe fought him, this is 1986. He's been there since the infancy of the division. He's winding down a little bit too. So I mean, if any time for him to get knocked off his perch, it was going to be by a stud like Overmont.
And what's crazy is you look at Gilberto Roman's record. He goes to Japan to beat
Mhm.
Watanabe and win his title, and then defends in France, defends twice in Argentina, then goes to Thailand, back to France, and then finally defends in Mexico in 1987, and then back to France, US, Japan, Japan, US, 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 and then finally loses to Nana Konadu in Mexico. I mean, like, the guy was a stud, and that's the kind of the downside to not a whole lot of money being pumped into these divisions is that sometimes you'll have cases where fighters are able to kind of just camp out and they don't ever have to leave home. And that's the
Mhm.
case for, like, I'll just kind of name drop within the same division real quick. Eli Pikal, who was
Yes.
the first Indonesian world champion. And he, similar to Chris John, was so popular in Indonesia that there was no reason to leave. And on top of that, it's kind of like, if you're an opponent, are you going to get paid, six figures to fight a dude in his hometown, or, get paid a low five figures to, somewhere else? And it's almost going to be, you're going to go where the money is. And so that's one part of it. And the other part of it is that the champions who are not popular in their hometown or whatever the case may be, they got to travel, where the money, they got to go where the money is. And so that also led to a number of these world champions becoming true world champions, globetrotters.
I mean, that's all they can really do. He can't just be a star. I mean, he could have been a star in Mexico and just defended strictly there, I guess. But I've never really seen a fighter just kind of stay strictly over there. Like Chavez has always been a world traveler because I mean he was a superstar, so he had to be in others of that nature. But especially in that type of division, you can't just kind of stay at home unless you're in that type of country where they command that type of stuff, like Japan, for instance. Ramon's from Mexico, so he was a traveler, and like wherever the money was gonna go, he was gonna go and fight over there. And like the dude again, he's been on the Hall of Fame ballot since I've been voting, since I started voting. You and I both we've talked about this before, Pat. We voted both of us have voted for him for a number of times. And it's warranted because all you gotta do is look at his record again. After he beats Watanabe, Edgar Montserrat was a really good fighter. Santos Lacier, incredibly underrated former champion who was a dominant flyweight champion, moving up. And when he beat Lacier, this was a guy that was still
Another fighter who belongs.
yeah, and who's been on the ballot before, and I think I voted for him in years past. You know what I mean?
We've
Like,
both voted for both of them. Yeah.
yeah. And he beats over him. Frank Sedeno is another former champion that people forgot about, a Filipino who knocked out Charlie Margary, I think it was, the Englishman, but for the flyweight
Yeah, the,
championship.
the French Englishman. Yeah.
Yeah. So he beats Frank Sedeno, loses to last year in a rematch. I mean, no shame in there because last year still is just an absolute brute of a fighter. Those Argentinian dudes in the 80s were ridiculous. You know what I mean? You had last year, you had the middleweight there, the middleweight rolled on.
Yeah.
Domingo
Juan
rolled
Domingo
on.
rolled on. Yeah.
Yeah, who was just an absolute
Victor
animal himself.
Galindez.
Victor. Yeah, Victor
Well, I
Galindez
guess
from the
yeah, that was a
80s.
little before, but still.
Yeah. But I mean, like, you just had a bunch of these dudes coming on the scene at that point, and then Julio Cesar Vasquez would soon come over there, like, and they all had the same type of thing, was that they weren't crude sluggers in the sense they were big, burly, thick guys, but they were slick in there too. They knew how to parry, they knew how to box, and they just sucked to fight them. At the end of the day, it must
Yeah,
have
a
just
lot
been.
of them had that weird, just kind of shifty puncher type of style that was like you couldn't sleep on them.
I mean, when they were always trained by real great trainers over there, like Amilcar Brusa and others,
Yeah.
so it's like, you know, they ain't being trained by idiots. But so he loses a rematch to last year, but then he goes over and fights Sugar Baby Rojas, who was on an absolute roll at that time and was 33-0, in a fight that people probably thought Roman had a chance of losing, and he puts on another commanding performance and beats him by decision. And at this point now, his career is winding down. Like I said earlier, Roman was that type of guy that, like, he kind of burnt both ends of the candle, at least from, accounts I've read. So a brilliant fighter inside the ring, not a one punch knockout artist, but one of those guys in the sense of like Pernell Whitaker, where he can just make you miss by inches and counter you and make you move and all these things. Like, you just wanted to watch him. You know, he just made everything just look beautiful in there. Like, you just want to put on jazz music or like some kind of type of like good background stuff while you watch it, because that's how it would be accompanied with. But by the late 80s, he's wearing down there. And plus he's had a long career himself. He turned pro at a very young age, and there wasn't a long shelf life for guys at 115 once you're already entering your 30s at that point. So by the time he fights a guy like Conadu was an absolute bruiser of a human. You know what I mean? A guy from was he Ghanaian? I think he was, right? Not a Conadu.
Oh gosh, I think so, yeah. But now I need to double check. Yep.
Yeah. Just one of and the same mold of like a Zuma Nelson, Ike Quartain. Others were just chiseled from stone. Can't really hurt them too much. They're gonna walk right through you. And great technique as itself too. Like, not really anything pretty, but they always have that, just, like a high guard and just kind of beat you up. And Roman was wearing down, and a guy like Conadu just beat you up. You know what I mean? Like, Conadu was a strong ass guy. He had a very underrated career himself too, with a couple of reigns as champion, wide range between them. But like, he was one of those guys that he beat the shit out of Roman, dropped him 5 times, just kind of beat him around, stuff like that. And Roman was basically finished. So by the time he fights Sun Kill Moon, another guy that we both voted for the Hall of Fame, and I'm sure we'll talk about in a moment, he gets stopped in that one. And as he gets stopped too, that was the end of it. But I mean, from that point, from 1986 until 1990, that 4 year span of his was absolute brilliance. Like, you couldn't really stack in as much as he did at that point. And his career probably would have continued, who knows? But like we said, it got derailed because he passed away in a car accident soon after that fight.
Yeah, and another one of the dudes that he had made a defense against too was, in my opinion, a pretty underrated dude was Kiyoshi Hatanaka. That's a guy who went on to beat Pedro Decima, and he also gave Daniel Zaragoza about all he could handle in a fight that really could have gone either way. But then he retired after that. And, that was
Yeah.
it. But I mean, that was one of the defenses he made too. Yeah, very, very, very good fighter, and somebody that people really should be going back to check out if you haven't already.
I mean, sure, and especially if it's not from hearing from us, listen to Canelo interviews, because whenever they brought him up, like, they've asked him your favorite Mexican fighters to go back and watch, or the greatest ones. One of the first ones he always mentions usually is Gilberto Roman.
Yeah, dude, there are a number of fighters. A guy that we mentioned a moment ago, Miguel Canto, is another Mexican fighter who gets underrated in the all-time discussion, and another fighter who is like, the whole stereotype about the Mexican style or whatever, dude. There's a long list of Mexican fighters who were stylists and not just sluggers and not just brawlers or whatever, but highly skilled or really good counterpunchers. Zaragoza is another one that, I just mentioned a moment ago, but Miguel Canto among the greatest, and Gilberto Roman, a great fighter to watch if you're looking for technique, looking for footwork, looking for just good fighting.
Totally. And he had a killer mustache too.
Yeah, he definitely had that like pre Yori Boy Campus like Super Mario mustache going on.
Yeah, he seriously did. He did not look like his age, because I know he passed away. What was it? I don't even think he was 30 when he passed. He was like 29, 30 years old or so.
Yeah, he was pretty
Or
young.
older. But he was like I said, in career-wise, he was old. Like he had been through it at that point, and losing to Conadu, which again, no really big bad thing going on there, and then get beat up by Moon. That was going to be the sign of the times because there was no coming back from that after a while. Like the division was going to be only growing from there. Moon was going to be the designated champion for a few years from there, and you know,
It was like Galaxy, dude.
yes,
You can't really talk about this division without talking about Khaosai Galaxy, especially because of I think the timing. I mean, like first of all, a couple of interesting things about this fellow. I mean, his style, and just like a lot of Thai boxers, and it sucks doing researching on Thai fighters
hmm
because the Thai in the Thai language, there's especially for like decades there was no difference between writing Muay Thai and just boxing
sure.
because like they thought of the translation of fucking Muay Thai as like Thai boxing, and so you would literally just look up like Thai boxing, and it's impossible, dude. It's a pain in the fucking ass. I'm telling you that right now. However, um, he was definitely a guy who had a really recognizable style, a fan-friendly style, an easy style to watch. And basically, in the US, once people kind of caught wind, the US fans who knew of him started referring to him as the Thai Tyson. And so that's how, like, I remember him being mentioned as the Thai Tyson in like US magazines and stuff like that. And then later on finding out that his left hand was came to be known as, I think they called it the punch that drilled the guts or some shit
I
like
never
that.
heard
Or
that.
yeah, I mean the guy, he was crazy, but like a number of former Muay Thai fighters, really tough to research, but a ton of ex Muay Thai fighters, especially around this time, around the 1980s and early 90s, switched to boxing. What exactly caused that? I'm not 100% sure, but there was like a flood of them right around this time, a number of them from the same gym too. And Khaosai Galaxy was apparently a very aggressive Muay Thai fighter too, and a very powerful Muay Thai fighter. And you can definitely see it looking at him. A number of these dudes come into boxing and their legs are like massive.
Dude, Galaxy was one of those guys, like you just said, when he came over from kickboxing, just built like calves. Dudes talk about calf talk on Twitter.
God, they're frightening looking. I mean, I'm not trying to stereotype, but Jesus Christ.
But it's interesting in the sense that like Watanabe we talked about, what we just mentioned before, was WBA champion, and Galaxy ended up winning the vacant title after it became vacant, and the vacant WBA strap, and it's like imagine if those two had a chance to fight. I don't know what would have happened, but Galaxy probably would have blasted him. But he was a guy that got moved up again pretty quickly, like through the division. And unlike other Thai fighters, where they usually when they turn pro, they fight for a world title within like their first 5 fights or whatever it may is. Nah, Galaxy built up a record. You know what I mean? Like he came in there like equipped with a lot of like experience before he ended up fighting for that vacant belt. And again, like all if you look at that record, if you look at the guys he's fighting over there, the majority of them you're not going to recognize any of their names. It's just other Thai fighters. A lot of them, making their debuts are 2-2, 9-1, 8-1, so and stuff like that. But one name that does stand out for me, and I'm curious if you actually ever met him, Pat, because he was a notable trainer I know in the Southern California scene when you're on the beat in the early 2000s, was Willie Birdlegs Jensen.
No, I know of him, but I never met him.
You never met him? Okay, because I know Doug Fisher talked a lot about him, saying he was in the gym with him, stuff like that. But Birdlegs Jensen, first off, I love that nickname. That's just one of the best names you can ever have out there. But was a tough as nails guy who was notable for being a Black American fighting as like a flyweight, junior bantamweight type guy in that era. Fought for a title, fought a number of different fighters. I know fought a draw with Goody Espadas and fought others and tough as nails. But by the time he ends up fighting Galaxy in '82, he's been along for a long time in his career, and Galaxy absolutely blasted him out. So that's a really good name on his ledger still then, because not a lot of guys knocked out Willie Bird Legs Jensen like that. So regardless of when it was, that's still a good name. And then from there, he's building up. And then by the time he fights for the belt, he's fought close to almost like 20 something times at this point. You know what I mean? Like he's developed himself a good resume. But what's crazy now is that after he wins this vacant title, every single fight in the rest of his career is a title fight,
Yeah,
more or
and
less.
it's kind of unusual too. As many fights as he has and as many fights as he had before winning a world title is kind of unusual for a lot of Thai fighters because again, they've
Yeah, I don't do that.
not to I don't want to stereotype too hard here. And also on top of that, I'm not like Mr. fucking Thai boxing history master. That would actually be probably the guy you mentioned already, Kyle McLaughlin.
Yeah.
He knows a lot about it and he would probably be the person to ask about it, not me. But I know enough to know that a lot of Thai fighters, a lot of successful Muay Thai fighters, they start when they're like, we're talking like 6, 7, 8 years old, and
Yeah.
they're sent to like a school, like not like, hey, do you want to go to fucking boxing twice a week, for like an hour? But like, you're sent perhaps not to live, but sometimes to attend, for extended periods of time, a Muay Thai boxing school. And so that's why a number of these fighters are like just solidly built. And I've mentioned this before, but it's kind of like you shake hands with somebody who's at like a fucking like a stonemason or like
Hmm.
somebody who's like in like construction. And like I don't have a small hand, but like I can tell like I shake somebody's hand and I'm like they're like crushing my fucking hand and I'm like, "Wow, you do work." Like and that's what I'm saying is like, somebody who's just a hard fucking brick of a human and that's what this type of training turns a lot of these fighters into. So by the time they have been in Muay Thai and then turn to Western boxing, they've already had like actual combat experience and it's already tougher than what the fuck they're doing for 4 rounds against some scrub. You know what I'm saying? With all due respect. So they don't necessarily need that kind of like feeling out process that a lot of American fighters might need because the Muay Thai experience was intense enough that like that took care of all that fucking they already know that they can take a punch. They don't need all that. They need to just go directly to a world title fighter like ranked fighters or whatever. So Khaosai Galaxy actually having dozens of fights is somewhat, you know, unusual for a Thai fighter and especially a former Muay Thai fighter. And like, you look at a lot of the names on his resume early on, like you said, you notice a lot of them have like the same last names, shit like that. A couple of them have Galaxy, and that's because they come from the same gym, or they will stage these kind of like smaller tournaments and stuff like that are tough to follow, some of them kind of shady, etc. But later on in his career, he obviously proved himself among world-class competition.
I mean, once you become champion, it's kind of hard to like stray away and just fight absolute cans, especially in a division in its infancy where most of it is consistent of like former
Not
champions,
impossible, but tough.
contenders. Yeah, it's tougher to do. You know what I mean? As the years went on and more people started filtering in the division, it got becoming, more commonplace. But back then, these guys got thrown to the wolves, and to be honest, Galaxy was no exception. I mean, Rafael Orono right away was the first champion in the division. A guy that was still hanging on there. So he ends up stopping him. Edgar Montserrat, who we talked about earlier because he fought Gilberto Roman, he was a contender at that point, a very dangerous guy. He beats him. Israel Contreras is a big name on his record for that one too, because Contreras at this point he knocked out Wilfredo Vasquez in 1 round, which was huge when you think about it, because no one ever really iced Vasquez like that. I think Antonio Avila did too, but regardless. And he also ended up knocking out Luisito Espinosa for a championship eventually. So I mean, this was a bad motherfucker right there, like a very dangerous guy. And Galaxy was able, ended up beating him too. Then you go through also too Eli Picao, who you mentioned was the first Indonesian world champion, and he beats him. And so right away, one, two, three, four, five, 1, 2, 3, like four guys in a row right there, most dangerous dudes in the division you can possibly imagine, and Galaxy just stomped on all of them.
Yeah, there was a popular Filipino dude named Ari Boy Blanca that he also destroyed in like 4 or 5 rounds. Who is a guy who was born in the Philippines and lived in Hawaii, and he was pretty popular like a couple years after gosh, what's his name, dude who fought Hawaiian Punch, dude who fought Arguello,
Oh, Andy Gannigan.
gosh, Andy Gannigan, yeah. It was a couple of years after that, and I think he lived not too far from where Andy Gannigan lived. In any case, that was just one other fighter that Khaosai Galaxy destroyed. But so getting back to kind of like some of the hallmarks of this division, one of the unfortunate things is that because there's not that kind of money often flowing through these types of divisions, because we get a guy like Galaxy. So Galaxy is one of the guys who stayed mostly at home. He didn't really do nearly as much world traveling as a lot of the other fighters did, and Galaxy definitely built a name for himself. And on top of that, again, not to stereotype, but many Thai fighters, once they build that kind of name in Thailand, they literally get the support of the Thai royal family. Like they will be like, you're living like a fucking king now. Like we got your ass. You're going to be not only fighting, but you're fighting at festivals. You're going to be headlining the festival. It's the King's Festival. It's the celebrate. It happened on more than one occasion. Pone Kingpech was another fighter who really got taken in by the Thai royal family in that regard. Um, and so, in any case, the unfortunate thing, getting back to that, is that because there's not that kind of money overall flowing through the division or whatever, the idea of unification is just not really a thing. Like it's not at the forefront is the way that it is in a lot of other divisions. It's not as possible. It's not as readily available and stuff like that. And so a knock on a number of these fighters is that there was less unification or less clarity as far as, like there'd be like two separate titleists who are just kind of have their own careers going on.
Sure. And like you mentioned too, there was no need. And once you become a part of that royal family or that's kind of putting you on, there's no need to go anywhere because why would you? What are you going to do in America if you're completely unknown, especially if you don't?
Exactly. What, I'm going to go to America and fight on
Yeah.
some undercard, get treated like shit? Why the fuck would I do
Especially
that?
because like you're a champion from Thailand that weighs 115 pounds in the 80s.
Yeah.
Like,
Why do that?
yeah, that was, very, very uncommon back then. I mean, the only one off the top of my head I can think about who did that was Gilberto Roman when he fought Sugar Baby Rojas on the undercard of Leonard Lalonde, I think it was. And I mean, that wasn't as bad too because, with Roman being Mexican and also too fighting in the US a bunch of times before that in the past, like at least he had a little bit of a name. But I mean, a guy like Galaxy would be a complete unknown. That would be like taking in the 90s, for instance, Saman Sojaturong. Remember him, the guy that knocked
Oh
out
yeah.
Chiquita Gonzalez and finished his career? Another dude too, who I remember reading about, and he was being at headline and festivals and different things for the king and the queen of Thailand and all that, defending his crown, racked up a number of defenses. If you brought him to the U.S., which was supposed to happen a couple of times, he came to the U.S., but as a challenger to knock out Gonzalez, but he was only supposed to be a sacrificial lamb. But I mean, as champion to come here, for what reason? Unless he was going to get paid millions of dollars to go to HBO, kind of like the guy did that lost to Eric Morel there on KO Nation way back. You know what I'm
Oh
talking
no.
about.
Damn. I'd have to look.
Yeah.
Wow, that was a while back.
A while back. We're talking 2000, absolutely.
Yeah. Damn. Fucking Eric
Well,
Morel.
I think he went to Wisconsin because he got paid enough to go there.
Oh yeah, yeah. Fucking Soren Pache Crading Jim.
There you go. Yeah.
Somebody just heard me say that and they're like, oh yeah, he's saying it like he knows who that is. I really do. He's fucking that's the dude with the Leo Gomez fight. That's fucking
A
great.
great Leo Gama's fight, and
Yeah,
that was
look that shit up, bro. Look
and
that
that was
shit
probably
up.
why he got the fight to bring got brought to America. So I mean, it's
Wild fight.
rare occasions, but like that's he had just that was gonna be like his first title defense or so when he came over to fight Morel. Same thing if you go down to junior flyweight when
We're just rattling off
Michael
these names,
Carbajal,
dude. And there's somebody listening to this so mad that we know who these fighters.
we're nerds, man. I don't give a fuck. It is what it is. And then you
It's
have
I know.
Michael
I
Carbajal.
have to laugh. It's funny.
It is hilarious. Then you had Michael Carbajal who convinced God, another one that's on the top of my it's on the top of my head. The guy, fuck. The one who Carvajal beat for the belt, he ended up knocking out Jungkook Chain and finished his career. And he also finished off Sachin Lala's career before he
Oh
lost to our
gosh. Oh, Kitty Kasem.
yeah, Moinche Kitty Kasem. That's another one that completely unknown and didn't really have the fan base. And yeah, I guess to build himself in Thailand, to command himself to get Carbajal to go over there, but they can pay him enough to come to America. A guy like Galaxy. So that's all I'm like building this around. A guy like Galaxy at this point, who had already made a number of defenses, had no reason or no need to go to America or go anywhere else for that money or being enticed to go there because there was no one that could bring that type of command that he was bringing. He was the cash cow of that division. He was the man of that division. Like he didn't need to go travel to go fight Gilberto Roman or any of these other guys. He was chilling.
Yeah, dude, that's like I said, that's kind of like that's a double-edged sword about these some of these divisions, or at least the history, because it's changed a little bit. And now, I mean, you could argue whether it's good or bad that the US has become a little bit more of a hub in these lower divisions, or that it's been easier to attract lower weight fighters onto undercards because there's a little bit more money for them and stuff like that. Some might say that's not good, some might say it's good, etc. But uh, again, that's just kind of the one of the double-edged sword type of things about these lower weights is that yeah, a number of these fighters just kind of stuck in their own little region, but it can't happen. You know, eventually those fighters are going to get defeated or something like that, and that's exactly what we wound up seeing with Khaosai Galaxy.
Yeah, and the thing with Galaxy is that what makes him stand out from the rest of them is that like these guys, yeah, they might stay in their country or whatever, but they only make a handful of defenses, then they lose and they kind of fall off the face of the earth
Yeah, they just
and
kind of
they
fade
become
away or
obscure.
something.
Not Galaxy. Galaxy ends up becoming champion until he retires, up until 1991. And not only that, he blasted almost every challenger there was. Like, I mean, it wasn't until the very end we started seeing kinks in his armor. He gets dropped in one title fight, comes back to win it, gets dropped in another one, comes back, and then in his final title fight in 1991 against Armando Castro, when he wins the decision on that one, I think he realized at that point it was getting to that. It was at the end. Like, what else was he really going to do? He wasn't looking to unify. No one was going to go out there out of their way to go look for him. And eventually, kind of like what happened with the Ponce like Khan, who just made defense after defense after defense, and eventually he just got worn out and ends up losing his belt. Same thing was going to happen to Galaxy one day, but instead he ends up retiring. And a couple of more notable things about him. One is that we have to mention his twin brother Corker, Corker Galaxy. Is that how you
Yeah,
pronounce it too?
Cowcore.
Calicore, something like that, right? Who hell of a fighter in himself, and one of those guys who suffered one of the more unusual knockouts you'll ever see in boxing history when he
Yeah,
fought Luis Vito Espinosa.
a damn good fighter in his own right.
Yes. Oh, I love Espinosa, but it's one of those weird fights where this is Galaxy brother we're talking about now, Calicore. He gets hit with a left hook, kind of like they're exchanging punches, and Espinosa hits him with a left hook, which he was known for. Espinosa had a nasty left hook, and he cracks him with a hook,
Mhm.
but it looks like that Galaxy takes it. He just kind of takes it, kind of punches his gloves together a little bit, and then he moves over, keeps on moving and moving, and then as it looks like he's about to start punching again, he suddenly collapses out of nowhere.
Kind of like that one we just saw like a week ago.
Yeah,
Like you
yeah.
like you saw that, like where the dude took a shot and then it looks like he's about to throw a punch and then he just like
Oh, the seizure?
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, yeah, yeah. And that was crazy too, because that dude missed that. I had to go back and watch it three times. Like the
And
dude,
supposedly like he that dude's fine, like nothing
totally.
happened. And I mean, but
But that was one of the most delayed reaction punches you ever seen. Like he hit him right there, and then like I don't know if it was like his body just didn't like connect to what actually happened, like sensory wise, but he jumped a couple of times. He tried to move in, and then he just collapsed in an absolute heap. And it was like, holy shit. It was crazy to see. And that was the end of his brother's career right there. But I mean, like, when getting back to Kawashe Galaxy, after his career ends, the Hall of Fame, I think it is one, two, three, four, five. It takes you like 4 years before you're eligible to be on the ballot. I wasn't voting back in the '90s, obviously, but he got into the Hall of Fame relatively quickly. I think whenever his name came on the ballot, I don't know if it came in immediately after he retired, but he was one of those that did not take him long at all to get in there. And that's really rare for a champion from Thailand, especially, or even, Asia for that matter, like a lower weight fighters, because they notoriously get snubbed by Hall of Fame voters over the years. So
And I was gonna say too, I don't remember exactly what year the ring started reigning pound for pound again, but
around
I know
1990.
and it was exactly in 1990 when he started when he got recognized in pound for pound, which
Yeah.
is, considering that you nobody had really seen much of him on video, compared to just about every other fighter. I mean, it's even more amazing that Yum Young Woo got on the pound for pound list at all, to be honest.
Sure.
But regardless, almost every other fighter on there had a lot more TV time. So pretty amazing. But he wound up, yeah, retiring. And I know that in the last like 10 to 15 years, both he and his brother have been running a gym in Bangkok. So, I mean, it's great that he's passing along whatever information he learned. I mean, basically just to beat everybody's ass.
I mean, that's basically what it really comes down to, bro. If you watch his highlight videos, there's nothing really crazy finessed about him. Like he's a good technician. He's not just like a weighed in slugger or nothing like that. But like it's just brute
Southpaw
force.
punchers, though, dude.
Yeah, man, it's just brute force. That low is a left hand from hell he would land on you. And
Southpaw punchers, dude. There's like, I don't know if there's any other style that I would not want to face other than
especially, yeah, a dude who can just annihilate your
fuck.
head with a left hand. Nah, I'm good on that.
Just southpaw punchers. Peace. Nope.
He could straight up fight. And you know what was great too? Like I said, he gets inducted into the Hall of Fame some point in the late 90s. I want to say like 96, 97, or something like that. And oh, excuse me. I just looked at it right now. He was inducted into the Hall of Fame in 99. So I just missed him by a year. Fuck. Because he never came back again. Never had a chance to meet him.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, well, he's not gonna now.
Yeah.
Ooh.
I mean, he's one of those usually those guys from those countries. I mean, like, from Thailand or Japan or Korea. Sometimes other places, if it's not that easy for them to get there, they make plans that they want to come back and all that, but money wise, it's not easy. Doesn't you can't expect the Hall of Fame to pay for you to come back every trip type deal either. Like it's different. So
Nah, well, and I mean, dude, I'm not trying to just jump on it here, but honestly, like, there's not a whole lot around. There's not a lot to do. You really got to go out of your way.
yep.
So it makes it kind of tough. Makes it kind of tough. But getting back to the 115-pound division again, unfortunately for a lot of US fans, there's not a ton of recognizable American names in there, at least not yet. But there's still a lot of really, really good names. Jose Luis Bueno is another fighter who kind of gets lost in the shuffle. But another guy who I really liked, and I mean, he's thought of very highly in the Philippines, and also on top of that comes from a boxing family. He's gone on. I think he's had two or three nephews that have gotten into boxing. I think his son. I want to say it might even be pretty soon, like a grand or like a second generation. But Jerry Penalosa, absolutely, that's another fighter that you could not sleep on in the ring, and also wound up coming back years later to show up a division higher. But Jerry Penalosa, a Filipino fighter who is very good 115 pounder.
Oh, he was a hell of a fighter, man. Penalosa was one of those guys that he beat a long reigning champion, and I think it was Hiroshi Kawashima, right? So whooped him up. I had read about Kawashima again through the Joy Koizumi articles and stuff like that, and I knew he was a good fighter. So for Penalosa to beat him silly was pretty, impressive in itself. Back then, I never thought of a chance of being able to actually see him live or anything. And then surprisingly, out of the blue, randomly, and this is why I loved USA Tuesday Night Fights for this reason, he was aired on it one day. No, I don't know the reasoning of it or whatever it was, but Penalosa appeared on Tuesday Night Fights in a non-title fight with a very tough guy named Paulo Saucedo, who I remember. And Paulo Saucedo didn't have the best record or anything, but who was a tough as nails guy. He won, I think, 12 rounds with Danny Romero before getting stopped. And unfortunately, I think he ended up killing himself. That's why I remember reading about him too. But regardless, that's who he ends up fighting on Tuesday Night Fights. And I was kind of hyped to watch it because this is a guy I read about in magazines. This is going to be my first time being able to see him. And what a technician, man. He just beat the shit out of Saucedo for 10 rounds. Broke him down, beat him to the body, beat him to the head, dropped him, almost stopped him. I mean, looked like the goods, and he was a champion for a minute in that division, like, a respectable champion before he ended up losing randomly to this Korean fighter named Inju Cho. And that was one of those things too that, like, again, I'm not going to watch any of these guys, but I'm hearing that Cho was a runner and he's a stinker and he's this or that, and you're just kind of like, oh, great, so that's what's going to end up happening. And then Penalosa kind of went into like a tailspin for a little bit after that. You know what I mean? Like, he lost a rematch with Cho. He kind of lost other title fights, close ones and stuff like that, but he was never really blown out. And he was just one of those dudes that you knew that, like, he was kind of like in the vein of Jesse James Leja, that you knew he was going to give you all his fun. You knew he was going to give you hell. There's a good chance he was probably going to get robbed or make it close enough that you're going to question it. And he would still keep on getting dates from there. And so once to his advantage, once Pacquiao becomes champion, and like that resurgence of Filipino fighters and, like, the popularity of them starts going on, this gives him a chance now to start playing his trade more and, like, getting seen more on television as opposed to like the 90s when he was just an obscurity. And that culminated. I mean, again, like, remember, he loses a ridiculously close fight to Ponce de Leon that most people thought he won, and then he gets that fight with Johnny Gonzalez.
He's a brutal body puncher.
Yeah.
And that was the problem, is that, like, he had a really good sneaky power. And he was the kind of fighter who's, like, his skill level was just low enough where if you were fairly skilled, you could kind of keep him off. But it'd be
Hmm.
a tough night, but you couldn't sleep on him. And if you slept on him, that's what happens. I liked Johnny
Sure.
Gonzalez a lot. It was one of my favorite dudes, and he got blasted.
And he was winning that fight comprehensively too. Like, it wasn't like Gonzalez was really struggling. He was outboxing him, like you said, able to keep him off of him until he just walked in. He got caught with a single body shot, and that was it. And I was happy for Penalosa for that one. I was really happy for him. That was a guy that trudged along for a lot of years, not being champ, had a number of close calls, a lot of bad breaks. A lot of other fighters would have been fed up and said fuck it and just quit at that point and just did whatever. And he kept on packing along, and he finally got, another chance at a world title, and he did it. And, to cap him off as well, I think I've mentioned this before, little Snapple fact is that when Punch Zone debuted, HBO Punch Zone, I don't know if people remember that, but the first time that debuted, the fight that they used it for, that they showed the graphic up, was Juan Lopez against Jerry Penalosa. And when they showed that graphic, it was really sad too because Penalosa took such a beating in that fight. And it just, everything, like, yeah, if you remember the graphic, how it would, like, change colors from, like, how badly you were getting damaged. And, like, Penalosa's entire head was just like dark red, like the whole features of it, while it was like showing things and like all this other shit. It was awful.
Yeah, yeah. It would be like yellow if it was just a couple punches, and it would, like,
Yeah, yeah,
progress to,
yeah,
like,
yeah,
dark red
yeah.
or whatever.
Like, straight up everything was just dark red, like his whole body, like the whole thing.
Well, and I mean, that shit, that was 2009, and by then that was his 20th year as a pro.
Damn.
He had a long career, 65 fights, which is, not a ton, but it's a good amount. It's a very, very good amount, and
Sure.
generally the that's to the amount that you don't see a whole lot these days. But the guy you mentioned earlier, Cho and Ju, tall for 115 pounds, a real pain in the ass to fight, kind
Yep.
of sneaky power himself, and not the kind of fighter that you would be ashamed of, losing against or whatever. And he held it to him twice. But then on top of that, lost a really close decision to Masamori Tokoyama, who is one of the, definitely one of the most technical fighters of the division and kind of an underrated guy. If you're making a divisional ranking or all-time divisional ranking, he's going to be toward the top himself too. And Jerry Penalosa held him to a pretty close loss. Yeah, definitely a guy that worth watching and worth checking out, because I haven't really looked, but there should be a number of his fights on YouTube.
Oh yeah, man. He was the guy that was featured a lot. And not only that too, like out in Japan and anywhere he fought out there, those fights were definitely filmed. They're not that difficult to find on YouTube. There's always some
Totally.
like freaks out there like us that we mentioned that would upload them if we found them. So
Yeah, I
you
mean
know,
Tokiyama was
another dude
around
too.
for a while too.
Oh, for sure. Penalosa just has that one of those long ass records, man. I mean, I don't know if I would vote him in for the Hall of Fame or anything like that, but like compared to some other guys on the ballot, he can at least maybe kind of breach it.
Yeah.
I'd put a
He's
bunch of dudes ahead of him in terms of getting on the ballot, but I mean, like,
he lost unfortunately he lost a number of like kind of like key
yeah,
fights that were really really close, like they were super close losses, but he lost them, you know, and
yeah, sure.
that's what kind of counts against you, unfortunately. But you know, not like they were fights, you know, that to fighters that sucked or something like that.
But like you said, yeah, when it really mattered, like we mentioned too, there was like ones that could have gone his direction, other ones too, but a lot of bad breaks that would have had many other people ready to quit. So,
You
but if you're
know,
gonna mention this division, go ahead.
go ahead, please
I
do.
was like, if you're gonna mention this division, and we were talking about the lack of American fighters in it, and like stars from that era and stuff like that. Well, as we talked about the early days of the division, we're talking about Gilberto Roman, and we're talking about Jiro Watanabe, and we're talking about Galaxy, and so on and so forth. Um, Eventually, it has to be mentioned that its star in America does emerge. It took a little bit, and there was a lot of fucking bumpy roads along the way of it to the point where even early on in his career, it looked like it was going to be derailed and done. And you got to bring up Johnny Tapia.
Yeah, for a second there, I thought you were going to bring up Mark Johnson because that's
Oh
still
no. Yeah.
that almost fit too. But no, he's a couple of years later. Yeah, Johnny Tapia, no question. Sad story, tragic story,
Yeah.
also mischievous character, lovable character. You know, no need to just totally recount his story, but just to kind of briefly sum up, excuse me, absolutely awful childhood. Um, Came from a background where he saw his mom get assaulted and killed at a fairly young age. He was like 11 or something like that. He was pretty young. And then on top of that, went to go on and just kind of just couldn't keep his life straight, couldn't stay out of trouble after that. Understandably, but somehow found boxing, got himself into boxing, found a love for boxing, and really became a hero. Um, I know that there's kind of a complicated relationship. He literally got kicked out of the city of Albuquerque, like was like not allowed to be there at all at one point. Um, and I know that like a number of people a number of people from New Mexico kind of view him as a troublemaker.
Mhm.
A number of people were, I think, at the time kind of sick of his shit, to put it that way. But I do also know that he served as an inspiration to a lot of people because he was able to channel a lot of the goodness within himself and also find the goodness within others and stuff like that. But beyond that, also as a fighter, fantastic fighter,
Yeah.
and also helped bring a lot of attention to the division stateside when there really wasn't a lot in general. And you know, that's not a small feat.
1,000%, man. It was like you mentioned, it was just the intensity of a guy like Tapia back then. Like he just brought this type of dynamic that was different from the ring. But with all that rage and everything like that, he didn't fight like a Mike Tyson or a guy that came out there trying to take your head off. He fought brilliantly. Like he was a brilliant boxer that had all this emotion and all this pent up aggression and like the vein of an Aaron Pryor who also came from a ridiculously bad background. But unlike a guy like Pryor, who sometimes just would go absolutely insane in the ring and just go wild, Tapia, I mean, for the most part, I mean, there are instances where he loses cooling here or there, but like when it came to putting on a performance in the ring, like in just like the actual 3 minutes of a fight, like he was able to contain all that fury and like mold that into the style that he had, which was just an incredible boxer. And so he had a great amateur career, never made it to the Olympics or things like that, but fought in a number of tournaments, won a number of tournaments, fought in the Olympic trials in '84, fought along until around '87 or so. And then by the time The 88 came around. I don't think he waited to try to make the team for that, and he turns pro. And as he turns pro from there, like again, he's a guy in the lower division. He fought like 106 pounds as an amateur, but now he's moved up. He's fighting 112, 115 stuff, and he's popular. He's like a really popular commodity. I know he was like appearing on top rank undercards early on, right?
So top, yeah, yeah, yeah. It would have been excuse me, would have had to be top rank. Yeah.
For sure. But like you said, there was already like whispers and demons of things going on with him, run-ins with the law and other stuff like that. And eventually, as he's like running up a nice little career early on and like gaining traction and making appearances on ESPN and other things like that, um, he gets busted for the first of many instances where he starts getting busted for drugs,
Yeah, dude. He was
at least
troubled.
publicly as a fighter. You know what I
Yeah,
mean?
yeah, yeah. Very troubled, obviously. Just couldn't keep his nose clean, couldn't stay out of trouble. For ranging from petty bullshit to drugs to, I know that he had a couple of more violent run-ins too. And obviously as also people know, his kind of his rock, his anvil was his wife, Teresa, who helped keep him on a straighter path, or at least as straight a path as he could stay on. And what
Mhm.
really helped, you know, what really helped, we actually did, this is a long time ago now. This was probably one of our earlier shows that kind of like I think it was Small City Big Following or something like that was what we called the
Yeah.
show. When we talked about how Danny Romero and Johnny Tapia had tangled, and it was like or maybe it was like a crosstown rivalry show, but regardless, that had really gained the attention of the boxing, the boxing establishment or whatever. And not only because it was a part of the country that is not normally thought of as like a boxing hotbed, but also because 115 pounds, and being able to find two contrasting characters like that to make it an interesting story as well as an interesting fight, that really helped bring it to the forefront.
Oh, 1,000%. And so his career starts, like you said, in 88, right? Like he's building momentum and he's like popular as shit. And people are just like enjoying the ride. So by the time he becomes a USBA champion in 1990, he's probably going to be on the verge of a title shot pretty soon. Like if you're the USBA champion in 1990, you weigh 115 pounds, you're an American fighter who's getting popular and traction, stuff like that. Like eventually, sooner than later, you're going to fight for a strap. And since the USBA was affiliated with the IBF, chances are he was going to go in there with a guy like who was champion around then, Quiroga. If Quiroga was champ, right?
Mm. Well, and that would
Because
have made sense as far as location too.
Totally. Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. Because New Mexico and Quiroga being from Texas, that's not that far from each other, right? And that's just both of their styles would have made for a natural, absolute barn burner. But it just wasn't meant to be because, like I mentioned earlier, I said Tapia was building momentum and then his career suddenly derailed. It was in 1990 when he got busted for drugs, and this was like the first public one where people just like, holy shit, like he got busted, and it looked like his career was going to be done for this one. I mean, like there was already like you said, there was run-ins before that, and there was already these things going on. And again, it's hard. You can't judge someone who'd been through the traumatic stuff he had already been through in life. Like I can't even imagine witnessing my mom get murdered in front of me, and then the shit that I had to go through after that. Like, don't even want to think about that. But he's doing the best he can outside of the ring, even though everything is falling apart for him. And then like the only place he finds solace is inside the ring. But you can't spend 24 hours inside the ring punching people. You know what I mean? Like you can't just do that.
Yeah.
So
And
anytime he's
unfortunately, a
down
lot of the
start,
characters that are associated with the gym are also some of the characters who you used to associate with in the street too.
absolutely, and the people that you run around with, and Tapia also too, just being one of those guys that's always just kind of looking for affection and people want to be around him and anything. And it's just bad news all around. So that happens, and his career gets derailed for 4 years, which for a lot of people would be the ending of a lot of careers. You know what I mean? Like, how are you going to build your momentum back after taking 4 years off? Who's going to remember you? Who's going to want to deal with you after that? How are you going to build it back? Like, think about all the times over the years guys have tried to come back after going to jail or doing something for a number of years. They've never been the same again. But luckily enough for Tapia, this was only the beginning for him.
when we were, and I was just talking about whether or not Juan Francisco Estrada can come back after, like, 2 years off.
Yeah.
And we're talking about 4 years, like, 4 years locked up. And the funny thing too is Tapia's story right around that time coincides with the rise of the WBO. We were just talking about the IBF, and the IBF's kind of rise to acceptance or whatever, in the WBO. In both cases, the WBO and the IBF were kind of boosted by the popularity of the heavyweight that was holding those belts at the time. And similarly, the kind of round robin of like Tommy Morrison, George Foreman, and all these guys fighting for the WBO belt right around this time helped push it up. But then Johnny Tapia won the WBO 115-pound belt. And so again, it's kind of tenuous recognition at the time. But then once people started following it and realizing that it might, be worthwhile because the fighters who were fighting for these belts actually are pretty good, like Johnny Tapia.
Oh yeah. And so Tapia is one of those guys that like, I mean, I'm not gonna say he brought credits to the WBO because no one was even really thinking of it as a belt back then still, you know what I mean?
But
But
that's what I
yeah,
mean, is in a way he kind of did. You know what I mean?
yo, yeah, I
Like
mean, for
the
popularity,
fighter
I mean,
makes
for
the
little
belt, they
fighters,
say.
yeah. I mean, I remember when I first heard about the WBO, when I first read about Tapia, that's what they said he was the champion. I didn't really know about it. And that's when they were like building up the fight Romero.
Yeah,
And
that's not to say that anybody called him
oh,
the champion,
oh no
but
no no no
you
no
know,
no not at all not at all. But like what ends up doing is that like he comes back in '94 and he ends up winning a number of fights. Becomes NABF champion again eventually, and then he fights Henry Martinez in October of '94. And generally, this fight is regarded, as far as I've read, and I watched it too, and it's pretty incredible, as one of Tapia's finest performances, if not his finest performance. Like the crowd was electric at the play. I think there was like the pit in Albuquerque or wherever it was held. Everyone was going absolutely nuts, and Tapia just put on a fucking masterclass that night. Beating up Martinez and ended up knocking him out. So yeah, he's one of the earlier champions of the the 115 of the WBO for 115. But the thing about that is now, not along with holding on to that belt, he ends up becoming one of the most dominant champions of that division's history. Just with that, with the less recognized belt of that class. But that's what's a good point that you bring up, where you said like he brings kind of credence to it because he became such a dominant champion in that division while just holding on to that belt. And by the end of the decade, he clearly showed he was the man of that division. Like no one was able to whoop him at that point because once he wins it, you know what I mean? He's not beating guys like left and right that are just like, oh my God, you know what I mean? He fights a draw with Ricardo Vargas, who was not a world beater, a tough contender, but a dude who you shouldn't be fighting a draw with, technical draw at that matter, but like struggling with if you're going to be like, one of the world level guys. And then he fights Arthur Johnson. And we've talked about Arthur Johnson before too, the former '88 Olympian. Um, Another tough as nails guy to fight because it's tall, he's lanky, good pedigree as a boxer, and he's not going to get blown out unless he's fighting Mark Johnson. But he struggles in that fight too, mightily struggles in that fight and almost loses. But it's after that where, again, he starts, but he's already built a following. He's been undefeated for a number of years. His personality and his backstory, like you mentioned, have already built him a big following. And now, instead of just being a champion in a division where he's just kind of going on the road to nowhere, if he just wants to keep on defending and end up becoming a Galaxy, at least he has in his crosshairs a rival that just moved up recently to that division. And not only is it just a rival of like, a guy that like potentially he could fight, it's a guy from his hometown and they're in the same division and they're both undefeated and they don't like each other because they had a bad falling out. And I'm talking about Danny Romero. So like Tapia was just coming in at the right time. You know what I mean? As him as the WBO champion now, making a number of defenses and then being televised on being televised on ESPN and different networks and stuff like that. And Romero being this absolute darling of the little weight guys, becoming the first American flyweight champion in over 60 years. Being featured prominently by Bob Arum, being the first flyweight title fight ever featured on HBO. Like this was big. You know what I mean? So they were on a collision course.
Yeah, and there was the, like you said, the backstory between them where like Danny Romero Sr. didn't, they were talking all sorts of shit, and
Yep.
uh Johnny Tapia's viewpoint was like these guys are, silver spoons in their mouth and they're set up from the get-go. and he's had cushy gym and sponsors and all this sorts of shit. And he's Mr. Nice Good Guy, but they're not actually even nice. They're kind of dickheads. I'm the real nice guy type of thing. And he was the grimy, he's the dude that everybody on the street loved and all the etc.
Right.
Whatever. It was kind of like other matchups where we've seen that have pitted the good against bad or whatever. And but what wound up happening, of course, was a good fight, a very good fight, classic matchup, and a classic kind of crosstown rivalry matchup. And I mean, dude, those guys hated each other.
Oh, they really did, man. And the way it got built up was fascinating too, because Ring Magazine and all the magazines want, they were like, this is natural. Why hasn't it happened yet? They just need to make it. But Aaron was trying to marinate it. Aaron was trying to build it, whatever they were trying to do, right?
He's
And
like
they almost fucked it up.
Marination King.
Yes, exactly. It's ridiculous. And they almost fucked it up too, because Danny Romero ends up losing one of the biggest upsets of the decade at that point when he ends up getting his eye socket broken against a journeyman named Willie Salazar. And and he ends up getting stopped. That's a major derailment, all right? Like a major one. So, people are trying to scramble and figure out what to do. They take Salazar and they put him in naturally with Tapia afterwards. And Salazar, the happy-go-lucky journeyman, gets a title fight on, I want to say that was on the undercard of Bo Holyfield 3, because that was the first time I got to see Tapia. And Tapia just beat the absolute daylights out of him. You know what I mean? Just kind of whooped his ass badly. But Romero, to his credit, I think he broke off with Top Rank at that point. He signs up with Cedric Kushner, and moves up to junior bantamweight. And in his first fight at junior bantamweight, he fights Harold Gray. Harold Gray was a respectable champion soon after Quiroga lost his belt. And Gray was, had a few defenses to name it, and to a guy that I read about seemed like a difficult proposition. And Romero knocked the shit out of him 2 rounds, just like kind of blew his ass out, right? Knocks him out. Like I said, knocks out Paulo Cecido on USA Tuesday Night Fights. Has a couple other fights, and then Romero and Tapia have a doubleheader on HBO Boxing After Dark, where Romero knocked out the South African fighter named Jaji Sabali, and Tapia knocked out Barrera's brother, Marco Antonio Barrera's brother, Jorge
Yeah,
Barrera.
Jorge. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Very lesser talented brother. And so
yeah.
um that looked like everything was going to be all systems go. And naturally, the fight should have been in Albuquerque. That's where everybody wanted it. That's where everybody was excited about. And of course, they got cold feet. And I'm sure there's other reasons for it, but they're like, we can't have it in Albuquerque. It's too dangerous. And then they moved it to Vegas.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's close enough that it's like not too awful, but
Yeah,
nonetheless, it definitely deserved to be in Albuquerque, and that's where the atmosphere would have been the wildest, no question. The atmosphere still was pretty good though. And I mean, it just wound up it was kind of like it would have been a greater crescendo for Tapia
sure.
had he been able to get the stoppage. But even so, it wound up being that, the talent or the quality told in the end, and he wound up gutting out close-ish decision that he definitely deserved, though.
I agreed with that. Absolutely agree with that. Like he put on a performance on that night. Romero is one of those guys that if you could take his power, he could be outboxed and he can be out hustled, and that's what Tapia did. And I actually, what's interesting? I should have brought that up in the last show when we talked about trainers. I think that might have been the last corner Eddie Futch ever worked. If it wasn't the last corner he ever worked, it was one of them. But he was in Tapia's corner that night. And
Yeah,
I don't know how much he really inputted on it, but I do remember at one point he yelled out, which was very unlike him. He did yell out, "Shut up!" to everybody because there was so many people like Jesse Reed and everyone else was yelling around and he was trying to say something.
well, I mean, unfortunately, too, like that was part of uh, the downside for Johnny Tapia was that he did love everybody and he loved people a little bit too much, allowed probably too many people into his corner, too many people into his, team and stuff like that. Started having a little bit of an entourage there for a bit, which included Mr. T for a minute, which is fucking wild.
Oh yeah, right.
He
That's right. You're right. Yeah.
well, and it wasn't, and apparently, according to them, he was friends with Mr. T. It wasn't just like Mr. T was like a hanger on or something like that.
Right.
He was honestly like in his corner and was like a friend of his, and so it was more than just that. But still, he kind of gained a little bit of an entourage, and you could see in the late '90s where he he changed a little bit too, and he definitely got into more trouble. You could see it in
Yeah,
him.
yeah. And you could see it too, like his face grew older,
That's what I'm saying is that like
like
I'm not trying to
his
be a dick,
body
but
shape as he
you could
moved up
see
in
it.
weight too. Yeah, like as he moved up in weight, he gradually started moving up. So like
Yeah,
he gives up the WBO belt undefeated at 115. After a few more defenses, moves up to 118, beats up I don't want to say beat up, outpoints Nanakonadu in a stinker of a fight. And again, still up there, and he's like undefeated for a number of years until he finally loses to Paulie Ayala. The anniversary of that fight was the other day recently, I think.
I
But
think
that
so.
was a
Yeah,
barn burner. I'm sure you watched that live too. That was a great fight. That was on Showtime. Big, massive upset. Big, massive upset.
yeah, and a lot of people too thought that the, man, he was kind of a Paulie Isla was kind of a frustrating fighter to watch. Um,
Yeah.
a lot of people thought that at least one of those fights could have gone to Tapia too. And I mean, yeah, but that was the first fight, especially was fine TV, fine TV.
To say the least.
Wasn't there like some sort of record on that too, like a Compubox record or something?
For which fight?
Tapia Ayala, wasn't there something
Oh,
attached to that?
I don't know. I'd have to look. I'm not sure. They threw a fuck ton amount of punches though. But I remember Ayala looked like he was the winner of the fight. Like I watched it and remember thinking he won it. Tapia, the way he was acting too, like he shoved him and was getting all angry about stuff. Like you can kind of feel like he had a feeling he knew he might have lost. But great fight. He rebounds with it and stuff like that. But his career never really was the same again, especially after the Ayala rematch, which he ends up losing. And he clearly won that fight. Like that was one, I think generally everybody recognized that he won.
Yeah.
And like you said, Pat, like the out of the ring issues started like doubling up even more. And now that we're in the internet age and things are just always out there, it seemed like every other month or weeks for that matter, he was getting into something. There was car accidents, there was drug overdoses still, there was this, there was that. There was I remember that really sad case where he had an overdose and I think his brother-in-law or something was going to visit him and had a car accident on the way to the hospital, ended up dying to go see him. Like all kinds of crazy shit was happening. But yet he kept on fighting. And like I said, he was as he got bigger in weight, as he rose in weight, he got bigger and his body wasn't in the same anymore. He was kind of more roundish. Added a bunch more tattoos to him. Remember, like all from that one, like what was it, like the Mary on his chest or something like that? Then he
Yeah.
added all
Yeah,
the
he
shit
had the
all over
Virgen
the
de
cross.
Guadalupe like on his chest, and then it went from
Yeah, yeah,
that to
yeah,
it. Then it was just that, but it was kind of bare. Like, but then
yeah,
it had
exactly.
Mi Vida Loca, and then it went and it just kind of spread out from there. Yeah.
And, his last big fight, his last few fights is in the early 2000s. The fact that he was actually still at the top, near the top, and still being used as a viable name in the early 2000s is remarkable in itself, considering his life. But,
Didn't he wait a second? Didn't he fight in like some god awful year that like bro, I was gonna say what? Yeah, 2011. I was about to say
oh,
like
yeah, he fought all the way up then. But I'm saying, like, his last fights
yeah,
as,
yeah,
like,
I know like his
near
last
the
actual
top,
fights. Yeah, yeah.
it was just like crazy because like you think for a guy that's been through all this shit in his life and all that, and yet here he is in 2001 still being talked about as a potential opponent, maybe for Prince Nassim Hamed or this guy or that guy or various fighters, Eric Morales for that matter, and then he fights Manuel Medina, another one who just been around for
That's
Jesus Christ
that's the
forever. Like,
fight. I
man,
think that's what I was thinking of. That was the CompuBox one, not
okay.
Ayala. Because I know Medina threw like a fucking like wild amount of fucking yeah.
Absolutely. And Tapia, I think everybody knew was shot at that point. Like that fight was at what, like 126? That was featherweight, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And he wasn't a featherweight. Tapia was blown up way too much at that point. Medina was bigger than him, slapped him around, too long, too lanky, another pain in the ass to fight. Ran around him all night. Tapia couldn't catch up to him. Tapia couldn't really do anything. And the fact that the judges gave him that decision, everybody, I just remember universally, it was just like, what? It was bad.
Yeah.
But it got him a fight with Barrera, and again, like that was one of those fights that like I remember watching that and I was hoping that Tapia would do good, but you knew he wasn't. Like, yeah, I mean, he was competitive in spurts, but like it was a wide decision loss. But I mean, that was it. That was it for him, But that was a great career. Like that was a really great career. And like you said, he did continue on a long time after, never really coming close to ever contending again for a belt. fought a couple of guys here and there, would lose one here, usually win a bunch, fall back into trouble again. But it was just,
Yeah, it obviously a sad case, and it would have been nice to see him still around. But I mean, he's just, I mean, I'm not one of those people who believes in the kind of like destiny like that. But
sure.
he wasn't like, he wasn't supposed to be on this planet long, dude. Like, I mean, he
And
had
to
no,
be honest, he probably lasted longer than anyone anticipated, man. He had a
wasn't he like brought back to life like three times or something too? I mean,
yeah,
the dude, he lived, you know? So
the
yeah,
nicest guy, man. Absolute nicest guy. You couldn't
yeah,
imagine a nicer person. When he was at the Hall of Fame, I had a
everybody
chance
said
to
that.
meet him. It was genuine. It was really genuine. He loved everybody. He absolutely loved everybody. I think remember one of those stories where he said he got arrested was because he said he got into it. Either he heard people making fun of an elderly couple or he saw someone trying to assault an elderly couple or something like that. Like he was out getting Christmas gifts and something was involved with an elderly couple. And he got very offended by it and jumped in and started fighting these guys and got into a big ass brawl. And then they asked him afterward, "Why'd you did?" And he was like, "I love old people."
It's
He
like
was like,
I could almost believe it, like that
yeah.
dude was involved in some fiascos.
He was like, "I love old people. I just felt it was my need to do something about it." They're just like, "Damn, man."
And another guy we could bring up real quick is Mark Johnson, who was kind of concurrent or semi-concurrent. I mean, a little bit overlap. Mark Johnson got a little bit more work done at flyweight than at
Sure.
junior bantamweight, super flyweight, whatever. But nonetheless, they're pretty close as far as weight, and also unusual in that sense that they're American fighters fighting that low and having success there. But similar to Tapia, unfortunately, Mark Johnson also had some issues outside the ring that kind of, derailed his career temporarily a few different times. And also, I think, kept him from being taken a little bit more serious in the US and was not nearly as popular as Johnny Tapia, not even anywhere close. But also he was probably a little bit more of a technician, a little bit more, technical minded than Johnny Tapia was for much of his career, but a very, very good fighter who gets, overlooked way too much.
Great fighter. Absolutely brilliant fighter. One of the best I've ever seen in my lifetime, I'd have to say, skill wise. When did you first find out about him on the scene or like ever hear about him?
I'm trying to think like what fight it was. I don't know exactly what fight it was, but I remember seeing a fight on, I think it was Fox, like, or Fox
Yeah.
Sports,
Hmm.
maybe. Which
Absolutely.
gosh, I can't remember which one it was, but I'm pretty sure I wound up seeing one of his fights on like Fox Sports in, like, it would have been the late 90s, and being like, damn, who's this fucking guy? I didn't know at the time, and I didn't know the history of nothing. So I just remember seeing him and being like, damn, that's a bad mamma jamma little dude. That guy's tiny but fucking shit up. But he was, one of those punchers that was like very precise, and like one of
Yeah.
those guys that, like, you're watching him fight and he's like uh very good vision. You know what I mean? Like, he's one of those fighters where, like, he's always looking at where he's punching and knows exactly where he's punched, like his punches are gonna go, type of shit. Like, at least in his prime, the last handful of years that he fought, he was like well past his prime and kind of pushing it. But even so, great technician.
Yeah, he's a brilliant fighter. The first time I ever watched him was in 1995 against Marcos Pacheco, and that was on Fox Sports, Great Western Forums Fox Sports. And I don't know, I must have been scrolling the channels and stopped on it, but like he battered Pacheco, who wasn't a bad fighter. He beat Eric Griffin a couple of times. And not, all overall rugged guy, but like Johnson beat him up, stopped him relatively easily, right? And like next time I saw him again after that was when he fought for the vacant title, and that was against Francisco Tejedor. Now, Tejedor I had watched before because, like I mentioned about Danny Romero being the first fighter, the first American fighter to win the flyweight championship in 60 years. That was on HBO, and he won it from Tejedor, who Colombian fighter and tough as nails. One of those dudes that, again, we've mentioned a lot of pain in the asses. I guess that's a trait in this division, a theme for that matter. And Tejedor was another one that, like, kind of tall, lanky, didn't have one punch knockout power, but like sharp punches and like threw a lot and was awkward. So like, a very tough, rugged individual, like most Colombian fighters are. And Johnson blasted him in the first round, like viciously knocked him out. And I remember everyone was like really excited because like people were feeling, he deserved to be champion a minute ago. This is an African American, black, a black flyweight champion, which is huge in American. And like, this is gonna like bring, some eyes to the division that otherwise wouldn't. So people were like excited because they're thinking, hey, maybe he's gonna get featured on Showtime or he's gonna get featured on this, stuff like that. And then it didn't happen right away. It still didn't. Like he wasn't getting the attention he needed. Like the Raul Juarez fight, I think that was held at the Inglewood. I'm pretty sure that was on Fox Sports. I didn't see that on ESPN. I never watched that. Alejandro Montiel, same thing. Cicilio Espino I think that was on, I don't know, ABC or whatever those channels, whatever it might be, stuff like that. But like, here's the thing: is that like you didn't really see him. You were reading about him. He was talking about how he wants to fight the best. He was interviewed on a lot of things. I even remember he was featured one time on BET for like a mini feature for like one of those shows. And but you just never really saw him though, like on the
Yeah, he
big
just
network.
never broke
Because,
through.
yeah. And like you said too, there was like a little bit of an overlap between him and Tapia. He wanted Tapia badly. He wanted Romero, but neither one of those guys, both of those guys were dealing with each other. They weren't thinking about Mark Johnson. And his contemporaries at the other fights, he'd have to go over to their countries to fight him. Yuri Barkachev, um, the Russian transplant who ended up in Japan, was not about to come to America to fight Johnson. Why the fuck would he do that? Johnson would have to go to Tokyo to fight him. Um, I know there was like another champion too from that division. That was the another champion from Thailand. It might have been like Yoktai Sithtor or one of those guys, random champions from back then. They weren't going to come over here. Like Johnson was kind of at like an ascend at that point. So he wanted to move up, and then eventually he does move up, and that's when he was first after his the Arthur Johnson destruction, which was on ESPN. And like he moves up, and his first fight on Showtime was against this guy from Thailand. And this is 1999 now. And Johnson, like we said, you mentioned he was already starting to have some a little bit of out of the ring issues and like other stuff. There was rumblings, there was like run-ins with the law, but nothing like really substantial. But we knew that he was like shit was going on outside. But he had signed with Cedric Kushner at this point, and he was hoping to get the big fights. But the problem with Johnson again is that every time you read about it, Johnson's going to make his debut on HBO Boxing After Dark in the next couple of months. Johnson's going to make his debut doing this, XYZ, blah, blah, blah. It never really came to fruition. When he finally fights on Showtime in '99 against this the guy from Thailand for the vacant IBF super flyweight strap, he wins the fight, but like the luster that he had at flyweight is kind of missing. Would you agree?
Oh yeah, no question. And on top of that, he's kind of lost a step. He's had outside the
Yeah.
ring issues already. And I mean, I think that there were a number of fighters from DC around that time, and I know that a number of them had said that they knew of Mark Johnson having issues in the streets, like that he was just kind of running around a little bit too much, and that had already started by that time. So it seemed like he had already kind of lost the step.
Absolutely. And so he's winning these fights, but he's not looking like, oh my God, impressive. Like I remember watching the Jorge La Sierra fight that was on ESPN's Friday night fights. And he didn't look good. He didn't look good at all in that fight. La Sierra, who ended up being, a long-serving contender throughout the early 2000s, um, was awkward and gave Johnson issues. And Johnson won convincingly by a technical decision, but he didn't look good. And at that point, I was thinking to myself too, yeah, like he's kind of lost a step a little bit. And then he fights a rematch with a guy he blasted out as flyweight Baby Juarez. That's like a no contest or whatever it is. And then that's it. Johnson goes away because, like we said, his out of the ring issues caught up with him at this point, and then he gets arrested. And I think it was because he beat his wife or something, wasn't it?
I think so. Yeah, there was some like domestic. Yeah.
Something that, yeah, yeah. But like he gets arrested and he's away for a couple of years. And by the time now, when he comes back in 2001, it's a whole new world out there. And a guy like Johnson, who's not a big fighter, kind of undersized now, but he can't go back to flyweight. Now he's like a bantamweight, junior featherweight almost, right? And it's it's one of those things that's like he's he's from a different generation. I mean, he's still not completely washed up. Like he comes back, but like the timing of it is just off now. Like so he fights Rafael Marquez. And the only reason why Johnson ends up fighting him on a rematch on HBO is because in their first fight, Marquez ends up beating him by the skin of his teeth by a split decision. And I think that was like one of those fights where they initially made Johnson the winner, and then they screwed it up and they called Marquez winner. Regardless, that was the fight that got Marquez on the map and started his own Hall of Fame career to where it became. But he still had one more highlight in his career. Remember when he beat Montiel in a fight
Yep.
that Montiel was trampling everybody. That was, really impressive and a good
Yeah.
way to come off his career.
Yeah, Montiel was young, flashy. I remember he kept coming into the ring with like the frilly outfits and shit like that, and he
Yeah,
was
yeah, yeah.
talking a lot of shit before the fight. And Mark Johnson came in and just, like he didn't like beat him up or anything like that, but he
He
like
schooled.
he showed his class, like he kind of like tricked him. He kind of he put the hex on him. It was
Yeah.
fun to watch. I remember that.
Yeah, he broke him down, he schooled him, and that was on HBO, and that was impressive to see that. And it was like, good, man. Johnson's finally getting his day in the sun, even though he's past it. He got another title belt, and he's there. And like, I remember his last really impressive win was against Luis Bolano, which I think was on some Showtime pay-per-view undercard. But Johnson beat the shit out of that dude and knocked him out. Bolano was one of those Colombians that had one of those inflated records. So for Johnson, everyone's, excited for him. But that was the end of it too, man. His career was over at that point. Like he ends up losing his belt soon after that, and then fighting Johnny Gonzalez, which is when you put them together, that just looks like an absolute nightmare. Johnson's a small
Yeah.
guy, very small, and Johnny Gonzalez is not a small guy. Yeah.
Yeah. And just illustrating, how far he'd fallen, basically, that he had to go that far up in weight to make something, unfortunately. But again, highlighting one of the issues with this division. Um, yeah, but fun division,
Oh, a
obviously.
great vision.
It,
So quickly before, oh, go ahead. I didn't mean to cut
I
you
was
off.
I was just gonna say the only thing that the kind of footnote on Mark Johnson's career is that the two guys who wound up winning that fought for his vacated belt wound up putting on a fight that gets forgotten about at this point. They actually fought twice, I believe. But the first fight was the one that was a lot of fun. That was Felix Machado and Luis Alberto Perez. Dude, that was a really fun fight. Machado's fucking eye wound up like this fucking massive and awful looking, kind of like Mamadou Tiam against Felix Trinidad. But like
Yeah,
they let
yeah.
it go just because they were fucking crazy and they just like let it keep going. But Perez wound up winning, I think, and it was a lot of fun. That show was a lot of fun.
I think that fight was on Showtime, no?
Yeah, I'm almost positive it was a co-feature to something, but I just can't remember what off the top of my head.
Yeah, the only thing I remember about Perez is that I think he was sponsored by Bic pens or pencils or something like that because he had the trunks, and the only fighter I've ever seen that was straight up had the giant, they were like yellow, white, and black, like the colors of it, and I had the giant Bic logo on the side.
That would have been awesome. I'm not gonna lie.
Yeah.
That'd be pretty fucking awesome. I've
Yeah.
used a lot of Bic lighters in my life. I used a lot of
So I
Bic
mean,
lighters.
yeah, straight up, he had the logo of it right there. So
No, sorry, I didn't mean to jump ahead of you. Whatever you're gonna
no,
say, go
no,
ahead.
no, but I mean, absolutely. Like it's one of those divisions that's had a lot of great fights. Not so many like, highlighted great fighters, but I think we like covered the ground of the majority of them.
Yeah. No, I mean, look, dude, we can't, it's even just a kind of condensed 30 whatever 30 40 years or whatever compared to the history of a lot of other divisions. That's short, but that's tons of fighters. And on top of that, like we said very early on, covering a lot of foreign ground that US fans aren't really familiar with. We can't possibly shove that all into a 2 hour episode, but we tried. We did everything we could. We did everything we could. No, I appreciate it, man. I know that we do have to wind up doing a little bit of research, but ultimately it's fun. And I hope that this weekend winds up entertaining and winds up being, clear winner, all that type of stuff.
I'd be absolutely shocked if it didn't.
Yeah, man. There should be punches thrown. There should be
Yeah,
punches thrown. That's what matters.
punches will be counted.
And you're going to be counting them. Yeah.
Exactly. Yep.
I appreciate it, bro. It's another good show. Very much enjoyed.
Most definitely.
Everybody, thank you so much for listening in. If you did listen in, whatever podcast app you listened through, go ahead and subscribe, leave us a little rating, comment, all those sorts of things. Appreciate it. If you watched on YouTube, hello, thank you so much. Subscribe, leave a comment. And as far as social media goes, Eris and I are both kind of, on Twitter/X, roughly, at least for the moment, kind of there. technically speaking, but the Knuckles and Gloves podcast is on other social media platforms, Instagram and Facebook, for instance. Go ahead and visit us there. And Aris, we'll talk soon, bro.
Have a good one.